Today's podcast features two separate, unique stories that are both themed around the same thing: true Mexican horror. The audio from both of these stories has been pulled from my YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's podcast. The links to the original videos are in the description. The first story you will hear is called The Ritual, and it's about a young man who was in the wrong place at the wrong time during his spring break vacation to Matamoros, Mexico. The second story you'll hear is called The Most Feared Girl in Mexico, and it is about the horrible thing that a young boy witnessed when he accidentally stumbled into a cave high up in the Sierra Madre Oriental mountain range. These stories are both exceptionally graphic. As such, listener discretion is advised. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please put a metal fork in the 5-star review button's microwave, set it for 99 minutes, hit start, and then leave their house. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into our first story called The Ritual. In the early morning hours of March 11th, 1989, 4 young men who were all in their 20s and all very close friends left their homes in East Texas and headed south. 9 hours later, they arrived in the beautiful resort town of South Padre Island, which is just off the coast of southern Texas. They were there to enjoy their spring break by sunning on the beach, drinking in bars, and meeting girls. When they finally arrived that night, they were so exhausted from the trip that they went right to bed. The next morning, when they got up, they went straight down to the beach and they had some drinks. And then by the afternoon, they were talking amongst themselves, and they decided that for their first full night of being on vacation, they would kick things off with a bang and they would go into Mexico and party there. And so they piled into their car and they drove an hour southwest to Brownsville, Texas, which is a town that sits right on the border of Mexico. And when they got there, they parked their car and then walked right over the footbridge that crossed the Rio Grande River into Mexico. On the other side, in Mexico, they found themselves in the town of Matamoros, which is very popular amongst spring break goers for their bars and their clubs. And so the 4 friends got a quick bite to eat at a hamburger joint, and then they made their way into the bars and the clubs, and they danced and they drank for hours. And then at some point, they got tired and left the bar scene. They crossed over the footbridge back into the US and made their way back to their hotel in South Padre Island. The next morning, when they got up and they recovered from their hangover, they decided they had so much fun in Matamoros the night before that they had to go back. And so that night, they piled back into their car, they drove back down to Brownsville, Texas, they crossed over that footbridge into Mexico, and then all night they partied and danced and had a great time. And then at some point, the 4 decided it was time to leave, and so they left their bar and began walking towards the footbridge. But that night, it was so crowded in Matamoros that you could barely move a foot without bumping into someone. And so the foursome split into 2 separate pairs. And the lead pair, they made their way ahead and they stopped at the gift shop right at the foot of that bridge going back to the US side, and there they waited for the trail pair. The trail pair, which consisted of Mark Kilroy and Bill Huddleston, they weren't far behind, but they got sidetracked when Mark saw a girl standing next to a house that he had seen earlier in the night, and he just wanted to go up and talk to her and say bye to her. And so they go over to this girl, and while Mark is talking to her, Bill moves on ahead and goes down an alleyway to urinate, and then when he comes back out, Mark and this girl are not there. Bill assumed Mark must have just moved on the little ways up to the bridge where the other 2 friends were at the gift shop, and so after looking around for just a couple of seconds, Bill makes his way up to the bridge and he meets up with the other 2 friends. And when he gets there, he asks the other 2 friends, where's Mark? Did he come up here already? And they say, no, we haven't seen him. And so now the trio's a little bit concerned, but they're thinking, okay, he must be with this girl he had seen. And so they backtracked a little ways and they looked for Mark. They went back to where he had been talking to that girl, and again, he wasn't there. And so they decided, okay, he must have already crossed the bridge and made it to our car, and he's probably just waiting for us over there. And so the trio crosses over the bridge into the US side. They get to their car and Mark's not there. And so at this point, they are pretty concerned about Mark, but they eventually convince themselves that he must have just left with this girl and they probably are back at the hotel together. And so after a little while, the trio decides, let's just go back to the hotel, we're bound to find Mark. And so they drive all the way back to South Padre Island. They get to their hotel room and Mark's not there. But again, they tell themselves he's not here because he's probably with this girl in another room. And so they don't worry about him. They go to bed. But the next morning, when Mark still had not come back to the hotel room, they decide, you know what, something's wrong here. We have to tell police. And so they file a missing person report, but the police get so many of these about spring breakers who go missing in Matamoros that they don't really take them seriously at first, because typically the missing person will just show up 24 hours later with a horrible hangover and no memory of how they got back from Matamoros. And so the police were expecting this to happen with Mark, but after 24 hours, when Mark didn't show up with a bad hangover, they were convinced that something had happened to him, and American and Mexican police suspected foul play because Matamoros and the surrounding areas are not exactly safe for tourists, but they didn't have any leads, and so Mark's case languished. 3 weeks later, a drug smuggler drove through a police checkpoint without stopping just outside of Matamoros. And so the police pursued him, and this guy ultimately stopped at this secluded ranch up in the mountains. After the police arrested the smuggler, they noticed a ranch worker was standing nearby, and on a whim, they showed him a picture of Mark and said, "Hey, have you seen this guy?" And the worker, despite being scared and not really sure what to do, he said to police, "Yeah, I have seen him here. The smuggler and his friends, they brought him here in handcuffs." And then the worker turned around and pointed up the mountain towards the shack that was about 400 yards up the mountain, and he said that's where they took him. And so authorities began walking up the hillside towards the shack, and when they got about 100 yards away, they saw this big metal cauldron sitting on the front stoop of the shack. And then when they got about 50 yards away, they were hit with this horrible smell of death and decay. And then when they got right up in front of the shack and could see inside of this cauldron and inside of the shack itself, what they saw was so gruesome and horrible that even the most senior and grizzled responding officers were totally shaken up by it. Under intense questioning, the drug smuggler that had originally led police up to the secluded ranch and the shack admitted that he was a part of a gang and that his gang had taken Mark. 3 weeks earlier, while Bill was urinating in that alleyway, Mark spoke to that girl he wanted to see, and then she went off, and then Mark was left standing alone waiting for Bill to come back. And while he was waiting, a man on the street parked in a red truck yelled out to him to come over. He needed help or something. He lured him to the truck. And so Mark went over to the truck, and then right when he asked the man, what do you need? Two men, one of which included this drug smuggler, jumped out from behind a building and tried to grab Mark and put him inside of this red truck. Mark was a very fit, big, athletic guy, and so he was able to fight the two men off and then took off running down the road. But he only made it about 2 blocks when another car full of gangsters showed up, cut him off, and then at gunpoint got him to come into the second vehicle. And so once he was restrained inside of this vehicle, they drove him out of the town of Matamoros onto some backcountry roads up into the mountains to this secluded ranch where they left him overnight in the car. The next morning, the gang members came back out and they wrapped duct tape around Mark's mouth and his whole face and his eyes. It just left a little slit around his nostrils so he could breathe. And then they pulled him out of the vehicle with his hands tied behind his back, and they walked him up the hill to that shack. This gang that had abducted Mark, that this drug smuggler was a part of, was more like a cult. And this cult was led by a man named Constanzo, who practiced a form of black magic called Palo. Constanzo would perform Palo rituals, which he claimed to his followers would make he and all of them invincible. These rituals, which took place in the shack up in the mountains, involved human sacrifice. Constanzo would tell his followers that these people who were going to be sacrificed, they didn't just need to die, they needed to die screaming. Because Constanzo believed the more agony he inflicted on his victims before they ultimately died and were sacrificed to the gods, the more power the gods would grant to he and his followers. And so the people who got kidnapped and marched up to that shack to be sacrificed were subjected to unspeakable atrocities, and Mark had been selected to be the next ritual sacrifice. After Mark was led out of the vehicle with his face all taped up, he was walked up to that shack where he spent several horrifying hours with Constanzo and his cronies, and then at some point Mark was killed when a machete was brought down on the back of his neck. Afterwards, Mark's brain was removed and placed into their sacred cauldron and boiled, and then Mark's legs were removed, and then a long wire was inserted into Mark's torso and fished around inside of him until they hooked it onto his spinal column, and then they buried his torso and his legs, and they left that wire protruding from his body up out of the dirt. There was basically a lead poking out of the ground, and the reason they did that was because later on, they could just pull on that wire and pull up Mark's bones and use his bones to make jewelry. Mark's body was one of 15 discovered in and around this shack. The total number of people that Costanzo and his cult ritualistically murdered is at least 16, but believed to be closer to 26. However, the police were not able to get the official number from Costanzo because Costanzo had his followers shoot and kill him before the police could get to him. 5 other cult members were ultimately convicted for their roles in the cult's murders, and they were each given a sentence of over 60 years in prison. The next and final story of today's episode is called The Most Feared Girl in Mexico. The Sierra Madre Oriental is a major mountain range that starts on the southern border of Texas and Mexico and cuts 700 miles south through the northeastern section of Mexico. About halfway down this mountain range on the eastern face lies a series of caves. And situated below these caves at the foot of the mountains are several small villages that are very isolated, and they're populated primarily with illiterate poor farmers. One night back in May of 1963, a 14-year-old boy named Sebastian Guerrero, who lived in one of these small isolated villages, decided to go for a walk up in the mountains, and he wanted to go explore the different caves. Now, this was something he did fairly regularly because there was a local rumor that there was actually hidden treasure in these different caves. Now, it's unclear if Sebastian literally believed that or if that was just kind of an excuse to go have a look around himself. But regardless, he headed out of his house and he began walking up the mountain towards these caves. The entrance to these caves were a couple hundred feet up the mountainside, and then each of the various entrances, which ranged in size from fairly small to enormous, were spread out a couple of miles in each direction. So Sebastian starts walking up the mountain towards the first entrance he can see. It's dark outside, he's got no flashlight, he's just walking up. And as he's walking, he notices off to his right, fairly far away from where he was, there was light coming out of one of the cave entrances. And he had never recalled seeing light coming out of any of these caves. Nobody ever went in these caves, especially not at night. And so his interest was piqued, and he decided he would kind of abandon his original plan to just kind of look around near his village, and he would actually walk all the way over to that lit up cave and see what was going on. So he turned right and began kind of walking uphill at an angle in the direction of this lit up cave. And so as he's walking, he's getting farther and farther away from the village where he lives, and he's starting to hear sounds coming out of this lit up cave entrance. It sounds like a person potentially, either they're laughing or they're screaming. He doesn't really know. He's thinking, maybe someone's having a party inside one of these caves. He has no idea. But after he gets maybe 200 or 300 feet away from this entrance, he realizes it's definitely a person, and they're definitely screaming. And it does not sound like they're screaming out of joy. It sounds like they're screaming because they're scared or they're in pain. And as he's getting closer and closer and closer to this cave, his anxiety is starting to ramp up because he's really starting to be frightened by what he's hearing, and he's starting to realize there's more than one person inside of this cave. In addition to the person that is screaming out, there also sounds to be a large contingent of other people that are either singing in unison or chanting in unison, but some group of people are doing something in unison while some other person is screaming out. And so he's really starting to get nervous about this cave, but he just can't help feeling curious about what was going on. And so he just continued walking until he was maybe 10 feet away from the entrance to this cave, and he plopped down behind a rock. And so he's not really sure if it's a good idea to look. He doesn't want to be spotted by whoever is in there, but finally he kind of works up the courage. He takes a deep breath, and he slips out from behind the rock, and he goes right to the edge of this big opening, maybe 10 foot across opening, and he peeks his head right around the edge of the opening, and he looks inside, and what he sees causes him to just freeze in terror. Then his survival instincts just kick in, and he turns and he starts running down the mountain away from this cave. He has no idea if he's been spotted or not, but he's sensing that someone could be chasing him, and so he is just running as if his life depended on it. And he would not run back to his village. Instead, he would run nearly 10 miles to the nearest police station. And when he gets there, he busts through the front doors and he's totally hysterical. He's drenched in sweat, and the police officers are totally caught off guard. And so they're trying to tell him to calm down. And so Sebastian finally would kind of compose himself, but then he just was not able to describe what he had seen inside of this cave. Whatever he had seen, he knew it was bad, but the words were just escaping him. And so the way he described it to police was he basically thought he saw vampires. And as soon as he began describing vampires to the police, they're thinking to themselves, okay, I don't know what's going on with this kid, but this just cannot be serious. And so they consoled him and kind of calmed him down and said, look, kid, I don't know what you're talking about. If there's any news that comes out of something happening in the cave that's bad, I'm sure we'll hear about it and we'll follow up. But for now, we're just going to bring you back to your village. And so at this, Sebastian was really frustrated and he was kind of pleading with the police like, no, you got to take me seriously. There's something bad happening in this cave. Someone could be hurt. Someone could be dying. I don't know, but you gotta go to this cave. You gotta go see what's going on. But the police at this point, they're just not really interested. And so they ultimately do just drive him back to his village. And so he goes back into his home. The police go back to their station and everyone just kind of goes to bed for the night. The next day, when Sebastian wakes up, he just can't shake what he saw inside of that cave. And so he would once again run back to the police station. And when he got there, he began pleading with the police, like, you gotta go see what's inside of this cave. I'm telling you, there's something awful in there. And this time, one of the police officers, his name was Luis Martinez, he would say, okay, kid, bring me to this cave and I'll have a look around. And so Luis and Sebastian, who was very grateful, they left the police station, they hopped in a police car, and they took off. And then, later on in the day, the other police officers, who were not really paying attention to this cave thing, they realized that Luis and the boy had not returned yet, and Luis had not checked in via his radio. And so at some point in the afternoon that day, the other officers began calling out to Luis. They began calling him on his radio and trying to figure out what's going on, but he wasn't responding. And so the police thought that was odd, but they thought, you know what, I'm sure he'll be back soon. There's got to be an explanation for this. But the rest of the day would go by without Luis reaching out to them, and he didn't return with the boy. And so by that evening, the other officers were genuinely concerned that, something bad had happened to their colleague. And so they tried calling Luis a few more times on the radio. It didn't work. And so the officers, they made their way over to Sebastian's village and they found Sebastian's family, believing that, maybe the boy was back and he could give some insight into where Luis went. But when they talked to Sebastian's family, they would say, hey, he's not back yet either. And so both Sebastian and Luis at this point have not talked to anyone all day and they are missing. And so the police at this point, they realized this is an emergency. They need to figure out where these two went. And so they were kind of understaffed. And so they contacted the Mexican army and they explained, we're missing one of our colleagues. We're missing a child from this village. And so the Mexican army would actually send out a military unit to assist them in going and finding these two people. And so the unit, they show up later that night, and the police and the Mexican army, they head out to where this cave was. And when they saw what was inside the cave, it would shock the world. To understand what was found inside of this cave, we need to go back 6 months to December of 1962. That month, two brothers, Santos and Cayetano Hernandez, who made their living basically traveling around Mexico, stealing from people and swindling people, they decided they were going to pull off their biggest heist yet. They were going to rip off an entire town. Their plan was to go into a small, fairly isolated village that was populated primarily with poor and illiterate people, and they would go in there and they would convince the villagers that they, the brothers, were actually prophets of an exiled Incan god. And if these villagers did everything they said, they would make them rich. And so the village the brothers identified as their target was a place called La Yerba Buena, which was located right at the foot of the Sierra Madre Oriental, right below where that cave was that Luis and Sebastian went to investigate. And La Yerba Buena was exactly what the brothers were looking for. It was home to only about 20 families that were all very poor and illiterate, and they were very suggestible. And so right before the new year, the Hernandez brothers strolled into La Yerba Buena and they put on this very dramatic show explaining how they were the prophets of the Incan god. And these two brothers, they were very charismatic and they were excellent salesmen. And so they really sold the lie. And these villagers, who were very vulnerable and cut off really from the rest of the world, they believed them. They thought this was their big break. They're going to be rich. We just have to do whatever they say. And so almost immediately, the villagers effectively became the Hernandez brothers' slaves. They would give them anything they wanted and do anything they wanted. But after a couple of months of this, some of the villagers started to be frustrated with the Hernandez brothers, the prophets, because it seemed like they were not really working towards making the villagers rich. Instead, it just seemed like they were horribly mistreating the villagers. And it just didn't feel like this was a relationship that was benefiting the villagers. And so when this sentiment began to kind of make its way around the 70-ish people who lived in La Yerba Buena, the brothers picked up on it, and they could have, at that point, just kind of abandoned their gig. At this point, they've robbed the town dry. There's nothing left for them to give to the brothers. But for whatever reason, the brothers decide instead to salvage their operation. And so the brothers, they leave the village and they go to a city that's relatively close by, and they recruit this young woman named Magdalena Solis. She was a prostitute, and they tell her, hey, we have this con we're doing in La Yerba Buena where we're pretending to be prophets of this Incan god, and they're starting not to believe our lie, and so we need you, if you're willing, to come with us and pretend to be an actual Incan goddess. And so when you show up, they'll know that we were serious, that we have a direct line to the Incan gods and goddesses, and they'll believe us again, and they'll fall back in line. And so Magdalena, she likes the idea of participating in this con, and so she agrees to do it in exchange for some money. And so she, along with the Hernandez brothers and Magdalena's brother, his name was Eliezer, and he functioned as her pimp, those 4 people, they went back to Yerba Buena, and when they got there, the Hernandez brothers snuck Magdalena past all the villagers up to that cave up in the mountains, and they put her in the back of the cave. They kind of hid her behind some rocks, and they dressed her up in an Incan goddess costume, and then once she was in there, the brothers went back down to the village and they rounded all the villagers up and said, come on, let's go up to the cave. We have a special ceremony for you. And so the villagers made their way up to this cave, and once they were all inside, the Hernandez brothers used some basic magic tricks and created basically a smoke screen. Once they had this smoke screen kind of billowing in the back of the cave, they secretly signaled to Magdalena, who was behind the smoke screen, and she knew that was her cue, and she leapt through the smoke and she presented herself to the villagers for the first time, and she declared herself to be a reincarnated Incan goddess, and if you don't do what I tell you to do, I'm going to kill you. And so the message she was sending to the villagers was so intense, they completely believed that this was an Incan goddess, and therefore this was not a ruse. The brothers were not lying to them. This was all very real. There's a real goddess in front of us. And so they immediately fell right back in line. The plan worked exactly as the brothers wanted it to. However, there was an element of their plan they could not possibly have accounted for, and that was what Magdalena did next. Even though Magdalena was fully aware that what she was getting herself into was an act, it was a con, it was not real, despite that, as soon as she jumped through the smoke and was standing in front of the villagers for the first time and saw the looks on these people's faces as they stared up at her, and she saw their reverence for her, it had this profound impact on her. This is a woman who's never had control in her life. She's been a prostitute since a young age, and here she is, the most powerful person in the room, and it's not even close. And it got to her head. And so when she left the cave that night, she literally believed she was a reincarnated Incan goddess. And she was not a merciful one. Within the first few days of her stay at La Yerba Buena, Magdalena used threats of violence on the villagers to completely take over the village. She very easily supplanted the Hernandez brothers at the top of the power structure. Now, the Hernandez brothers probably were quite surprised to see this happen because they were expecting Magdalena to play more of a prop role to keep them in power, not the other way around. But ultimately, they kind of just went along with it because through Magdalena's control over the villagers, they were able to continue to exploit the villagers, and so they were getting what they wanted out of this relationship. Within a few weeks of being in La Yerba Buena, Magdalena was not only abusing every villager in every horrible way imaginable, she also was becoming completely delusional. She convinced herself that in order to survive, she needed to start drinking blood. And so she demanded all the villagers provide her with blood. And so in fear of retribution, the villagers began slaughtering all of their farm animals and their own pets so Magdalena could drink their blood. For weeks and weeks and weeks, the horrible abuse Magdalena would dole out on the villagers would continue, and these blood rituals would continue. And then finally, sometime in April, 2 of the villagers decided, you know what, I've had enough. I don't believe Magdalena is actually an Incan goddess. I don't believe the Hernandez brothers are actually prophets. I think this is all a scam. And so they decided the way they would handle this is they were just going to flee the village. Now, somehow their plans to run away got out, and the Hernandez brothers found out about it, and they, in turn, told Magdalena about it, and when she heard the news, she immediately told everyone in the village to make their way up to the cave for a special ceremony. So all the villagers, including the two people that were planning on running away, they made their way up to the cave, and once everyone was inside, Magdalena walked to the front of the group and she pointed at the two dissenters, the two people that were planning on running, and she demanded that the rest of the villagers kill them. And on the spot, all of the other villagers jumped on top of the two dissenters and they lynched them. They beat them to death in the cave. And then after these two people have been killed, Magdalena orders their bodies be strung up on these two pikes she had set up in the back of the cave because she knew what she was going to be doing up in this cave. And so after these two bodies were strung up on these pikes, Magdalena grabs a chalice and she walks over to these two bodies and she presses the chalice up against their bodies where they're bleeding from, and she fills it up and then she drinks from the chalice. And at this point, everything changed. Suddenly, Magdalena understood that it wasn't good enough to just be drinking animal blood. That was not enough to keep her, a goddess, alive. She now could only consume human blood. And so for the next several weeks, periodically, Magdalena would order everyone in the village to go back up to the cave for a blood ritual, which they all knew what this entailed. This no longer had anything to do with animals. This was human blood rituals. She would order them up and they would have no idea who was going to be the sacrifice. And so all these people, they get inside this dark cave, and then Magdalena shows up and she stands in front of them, and after kind of looking them over, she identifies her next sacrifice, and out of fear, the other villagers, who were the friends and family of the victim, would launch themselves on top of the chosen sacrifice and lynch them in the cave. And then afterwards, their body would be strung up on one of the pikes, and Magdalena would walk over with her chalice, she would fill it with blood, and she would drink it. And so this would go on and on for several weeks. And one of the most distressing aspects of these human sacrifices is that as she did more and more and more of them, Magdalena got it in her head that beating the sacrifice to death before consuming their blood was spoiling the blood in some way. And so what she began doing was she would have the other villagers beat the sacrifice into submission, and then she would have the sacrifice strung up to one of the pikes while they were still alive, and then she would carve their heart out while they were alive, and then she would drink their blood. So in May of 1963, when Sebastian, the 14-year-old boy, when he poked his head around and looked into that cave, he watched one of these sacrifices having their heart cut out. And he didn't know what to make of it, and so he ran to the police, and then the next day, he and the police officer, Luis Martinez, they would go back to the cave, and Magdalena and her cult would spot them, capture them, and drag them both into the cave, and both of them would be ritualistically sacrificed. They would have their hearts cut out, and Magdalena would drink their blood. When the police and army arrived in La Yerba Buena, it was a ghost town because all of the villagers had been ordered up to the cave where they had barricaded themselves inside with weapons because Magdalena probably knew there was going to be a big police response because one of their officers has gone missing out here. They're bound to be found out. And so when the police and the army reached the cave, there's this big shootout with all of the villagers. And during the shootout, the majority of the villagers are killed. Also, the Hernandez brothers, they're also killed in the shootout. And then after the shootout stops, the police and the army would go into this cave and they would discover the pikes, the bloody pikes that are in the back of the cave with bits of human remains all over the ground. And then they would leave the cave and they would search the town and they would find the remains of Luis and Sebastian outside a particular shack. And then inside the shack was Magdalena and her brother Eliezer. They were still alive. They were trying to hide from the authorities, and so they would be arrested. It's believed Magdalena sacrificed and drank the blood of at least 15 of the villagers over a 6-week period. However, the only remains to be positively identified were Luis Martinez and Sebastian Guerrero. Ultimately, Magdalena and her brother Eliezer were sentenced to 50 years in prison, and all of the surviving villagers who participated in these sacrifices or who participated in the shootout with police and the army, they were given 30 years in prison. Amazingly, none of the villagers ever testified against Magdalena or her brother, despite the fact they were almost certainly offered reduced sentences in exchange for their testimony. Clearly, they were more terrified of the Incan goddess than they were terrified of the prospect of 30 years in prison. Although the exact date of when this happened is not known, Magdalena would eventually die behind bars. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please put a metal fork in the 5-star review button's microwave, set it for 99 minutes, hit start, and then leave their house. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In 2010, a tutor stepped inside of her student's apartment. At first, it was quiet. Then a terrified voice called out to her from the bedroom. Had she known what was waiting for her inside of that bedroom, she would have turned and ran. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the 5-star review button's home and turn the batteries in every remote in the wrong direction. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. When 23-year-old Juri Kibuishi walked into a room, you couldn't help but notice her. Just 5 foot 3 inches tall, beautiful and outgoing, Juri, whose Americanized name was Julie, had a freewheeling personality and instinctive kindness that just drew people to her. From the flowers that she often pinned in her dark hair to her dramatic eyeliner and colorful painted fingernails, Julie looked like what she was, creative and unconventional. Despite their much more proper and low-key appearance, Julie's Japanese-born parents had always encouraged their daughter's artistic pursuits. And when Julie, a lifelong resident of Irvine, California, was high school-aged, she was accepted into the prestigious Orange County School for the Arts. This was a highly selective charter school that catered to students who were especially interested in the visual and performing arts. But Julie's parents had also stressed the importance to all 4 of their children of getting excellent grades. So even as Julie spent 5 years studying dance and becoming a gifted and passionate performer, she also applied herself with just as much energy to her college preparatory courses. Julie's goal after high school was to dance and to eventually get a degree in fashion design. She found just the program she wanted at Orange Coast College in Costa Mesa, California, one of the top transfer community colleges in the country, and just a 30-minute drive from Irvine, California, where Julie lived with her parents. At Orange Coast, Julie could get her associate's degree and start work in fashion right away, and then if she wanted to, she could transfer to a 4-year college. She would also have time to take dance classes and keep performing. Located 37 miles south of Los Angeles, Costa Mesa is a busy commercial city about a mile from the Pacific coast. Not nearly as expensive as Los Angeles, Costa Mesa was a magnet for aspiring actors and artists and writers who hoped to make their way into some aspect of show business, whether it was movies, the stage, dancing, or script writing. Julie loved the creative energy at Orange Coast, and she also loved all the different types of people who are drawn to a community college, from older students with day jobs to younger students like herself. One of these students was 26-year-old Samuel Herr, an Army veteran whose military service included 15 months in a remote and dangerous outpost in Afghanistan. 5 foot 10 inches tall and 200 pounds, Sam had movie star good looks and an outgoing personality. An only child of older parents, Sam's father had served in the Marines, and like his father, Sam had also found purpose, meaning, and self-discipline during his time in the military. Sam's fellow soldiers described him as courageous and funny. The women he served with described him as very professional and chivalrous. In 2010, after his Army enlistment ended, Sam had also enrolled in Orange Coast College in Costa Mesa. This was the first step in his plan to earn the college degree that he needed in order to re-enter the military as an officer. Although Julie and Sam came from very different backgrounds, as soon as they met each other in an anthropology class, they totally hit it off. Not in a romantic sense, each of them had serious long-distance relationships with other people, but as friends. Both of them were very close with their families, they enjoyed socializing, and they both had the same outgoing personalities and the same slightly goofy sense of humor and fun. They also both liked tattoos. Julie had 7 of them, and Sam had ink on both arms as well as a huge heart inscribed with Mom and Dad tattooed on his chest. But on a deeper level, Sam and Julie were also both very serious about getting good grades in college and ultimately achieving their long-term career goals. So as soon as Julie realized that her classmate Sam was struggling in their anthropology class, she offered to help tutor him. One evening, when Sam's parents stopped by their son's apartment and met Julie, who was there helping Sam with his homework, they were both struck by the easy friendship between their son and Julie. And when Julie would go on to describe Sam to her parents, she would say they were just friends. One of the nice things for both of them about being in a strictly platonic relationship was being able to talk to one another about their romantic partners. Julie was in an online relationship with a Marine corporal named Mark, who was stationed in Okinawa, Japan, and Sam was engaged to a German woman named Katerina, whom he had met while he was in the service. Sam also felt comfortable opening up to Julie about his combat experience in Afghanistan and the night terrors that he had brought home with him. As their friendship grew, Julie began spending more time with Sam outside of just tutoring, and one thing they both liked to do together was spend time with the group of young people who often gathered in the evenings and on the weekends outside of the large apartment complex where Sam lived. For Sam, the Camden Martinique Apartments, which is where he lived, were the perfect location. It was less than a half mile from Orange Coast College and only a 30-minute drive from where his parents lived in Anaheim Hills. The rent wasn't cheap, but Sam had always been very careful with money, and he had saved $62,000 in combat pay that he had earned while he was serving in Afghanistan. Among the big group of young people who hung out together at the apartment's pool and outdoor patios, there was one couple in particular that Julie and Sam got to know pretty well. 26-year-old actor Daniel Wozniak and his fiancée, 23-year-old actress Rachel Buffett. Like a lot of actors, Dan and Rachel struggled to make ends meet even as they dreamed of breaking into the Los Angeles acting scene. Rachel, who was small with delicate features and long blonde hair, still looked the part of the Disney princess she once played at Disneyland when she was a teenager. Dan, who was a big guy, had an easy smile, thick dark hair, good looks, and a booming voice that helped him land lead roles in the community theaters where he and Rachel often starred opposite one another. Usually dressed in khaki shorts or pants and Hawaiian shirts with bright prints, Dan never felt more at home or more genuinely himself than when he was on stage. In the spring of 2010, when Julie and Sam met Dan and Rachel, Rachel was busy planning the couple's wedding. After a 2-year-long engagement, the big date was finally just weeks away, May 28th, and afterward the couple would go to Mexico for their honeymoon. On Friday, May 21st, just a week before Dan and Rachel were going to get married, Julie had a date with her older brother, Taka, at a Thai restaurant in Long Beach to talk about his wedding. Taka also had a surprise for his younger sister. He and his fiancée wanted Julie to be a bridesmaid at their wedding, and that night at dinner, Taka handed Julie the tiara that she would be wearing on Taka's big day. Julie was thrilled, but she was also feeling a little distracted and worried. Throughout that afternoon and evening, Julie had started to receive a series of very strange text messages from her friend Sam. He sounded upset, and he told her he needed to talk to someone. In what she thought must be a bad attempt at humor, he wrote, "No sex. Can you come over tonight at around midnight? Just talk, don't tell anyone. Going out for a little now. Some bad family stuff." Julie was puzzled. Like her, Sam seemed to get along with his mother and father really well. In fact, she thought he was supposed to be visiting with them in Anaheim that weekend. Julie told her brother about these weird messages she was getting. Taka asked her if this was normal for Sam, and she said no, but Sam had been through a lot. Noticing her brother looking concerned, Julie looked up from her phone and smiled at him and said, "Don't worry, you'd like Sam." After dinner, Julie said goodbye to her brother, and laughing, she put the tiara on just before stepping out into the clear 60-degree evening. She could feel the light breeze from the ocean as she climbed into her car to make the 35-minute drive south from Long Beach to the Camden Martinique apartments where Sam was. The following morning, Julie's mother, June, looked down the bedroom hallway of their house and noticed the door to her daughter's bedroom was open. Peeking inside, she saw Julie was not in there, and she realized in that moment that her daughter had not come home the night before. June immediately called and texted Julie, but received no answer. When she called her son Taka to see if maybe Julie had stayed the night with him and his fiancée, June's worry deepened to alarm. Taka said no, Julie was not with them, and he told his mother about the very strange text messages that Julie had received from her friend Sam. Feeling very concerned, Taka and his mother began scrolling through their texts and contacts to see if they could find Sam's number. Meanwhile, about 20 miles away in Anaheim, Sam's parents had also begun worrying about their child. Sam was supposed to visit them that morning, but he hadn't shown up yet. Sam had always been good about letting his parents know if his plans had changed or if he was running late, but by midday, they still had not gotten a call or text from him. By late afternoon, Sam's father, Steve, who was an athletic-looking man with thick white hair who often went to the gym with his son, he hopped into his car and drove up to Costa Mesa to make sure Sam was okay. Once Steve arrived at the Camden Martinique apartments, it was getting dark. He walked up the stairs to apartment D110 and knocked on the door. When he didn't hear an answer, Steve reached into his pocket and pulled out the spare apartment key that Sam had given him. He unlocked the door and he stepped inside. Turning on the light, Steve saw immediately that there was no one in the kitchen or living room and also no sign of any disturbance. As he headed toward the bedroom, he hoped he'd find his son laid up in bed with a bad cold. Instead, as he pushed open the door to the bedroom and flipped on the wall light, it was like he had discovered a chamber of horrors. Kneeling next to the bed with her upper body lying stomach down on top of the mattress was the body of a young woman. Her jeans, which were cut or torn, had been pulled down almost to her knees. On the back of her sweater, scrawled in black magic marker, were the words, "All yours, F you." Although one side of the woman's face was visible, she was totally unrecognizable. Her features were covered in blood and gore, and all Steve could really see was just this massive wound above and behind her ear. It looked like the back of her head had been blown off. And just above that crater of bone, blood, and brain tissue, Steve saw a tiara tangled in a mass of blood-soaked hair. Shocked, Steve backed away from the gruesome scene, and after quickly checking the other rooms and finding no one else in the apartment, he pulled out his phone and he dialed 911. Near the doorway to the bedroom, police found a colorful shoulder bag. It contained a cell phone and a wallet with a driver's license. The victim, sprawled on the bed and the floor, was 23-year-old Julie Kibuishi. When they were informed by police that their daughter was dead, Julie's parents were devastated. June Hibuishi kept telling the officers they must have made a mistake. The evening before, she and her daughter had been cooking together in the kitchen. When it had been time for Julie to go see her brother at the restaurant, she had changed her clothes, given her mom a quick hug, said goodbye, and stepped out the door. It was impossible to June and her husband that this daughter, who was so kind and so full of life, could now just be dead. As for the Costa Mesa detectives who arrived on the scene moments after receiving Steve Herr's frantic 911 call, every piece of evidence they discovered inside of that apartment pointed to Steve's son, Sam. Sam knew the victim, and from the words written on the back of Julie's sweater and the position of her body that suggested sexual assault, she may have been caught up in a love triangle gone wrong, or been the victim of a domestic dispute with Sam. Most damning of all was the long string of strange text messages that Sam had sent Julie the night before, begging her to come see him immediately. And even though Sam said, quote, "no sex" in one of his text messages, just the mention of sex seemed to indicate that it was possible that these two were, in fact, romantically involved, despite what they told people. And then there was Sam's military background and his combat experience in Afghanistan, and the possibility that Sam, like many combat veterans, was affected by post-traumatic stress disorder. Maybe Sam had just snapped and killed Julie during an episode of combat-related psychosis. The cause of death appeared to be a single gunshot wound to Julie's head, and as a trained combat soldier, Sam would have known how to use a firearm. 24 hours later, when Sam still had not been located or heard from, the Costa Mesa police had found yet another reason to suspect he was their killer. After digging into Sam's background, detectives were stunned to discover that back in 2002, when Sam was 18 years old, he had been arrested and charged in connection with the murder of another teenager. Although Sam was eventually acquitted and cleared of all charges, he had been a serious suspect, and he had spent the better part of a year behind bars. The police wasted no time. They issued an all-points bulletin with Sam's picture and physical description plastered across the top of it. Meanwhile, however bad things looked for Sam, Steve Herr could not believe that his son killed Julie. Sam had been acquitted of all criminal charges related to that 2002 murder, and even after the trauma and stigma of spending months in jail, Sam had gone on to rebuild his life and reputation. He always had a steady job from that point forward, but it was when he enlisted in the army that he found his true sense of meaning and purpose. So while police launched a massive manhunt for the man they considered armed and dangerous, Sam's father started to do his own digging. If Sam was on the run, he would need money, and Steve shared a bank account with his son. Sure enough, when Steve accessed the shared account, he saw that every day since his disappearance, Sam had used his ATM card to make a series of large cash withdrawals. The trail led south to a bank of ATMs in Long Beach. The police had also tracked Sam's ATM card, and unlike Steve, they had access to the video surveillance at the ATMs. Looking at the camera footage, detectives expected to see the face of Sam Herr. Instead, the person seen using Sam's card was a teenage boy carrying a skateboard and wearing sunglasses and a hoodie. When the same ATM card was used to place a pizza order at a nearby pizza joint called Echoes, police were able to get the address of the house where the pizza would be delivered. They staked out that address, thinking that maybe Sam was hiding inside of the house, but when police, guns drawn, entered the house right alongside the pizza delivery person, the only people they found inside were the teenager they'd seen on the ATM surveillance tape and his mother. A terrified 16-year-old Wesley Freilich told police that he had been given the ATM card by a man he knew who was working for a bail bonds agent. The man had told Wesley that the card belonged to a client who had posted bond but then disappeared without paying the agent. According to Wesley, this man who had given him the ATM card was someone his mom knew through the community acting that she did. Wesley said he was a good guy and he trusted him when this guy outlined the plan with the ATM card. Wesley would make withdrawals every day of up to $400 and turn the money over to the man who would wait in his parked car some distance from each ATM machine. As payment for doing this, Wesley would be allowed to use this ATM card to order pizza for himself. The name of this mystery man was instantly familiar to police: 26-year-old actor Daniel Wozniak. Daniel and his fiancée Rachel, who were both friends with Sam and Julie, had been among the residents of the apartment complex that police had interviewed the day after Julie's body had been discovered. And in the course of that routine interview with them, Dan had told police that he and Rachel had last seen Sam on the afternoon of Friday, May 21st, which was the night Julie had dinner with her brother before going to see Sam. Daniel told police that he, Rachel, and Sam had chatted briefly that night, and then Sam had left the apartment complex with a man in a black hat who Dan did not recognize. After determining that the 16-year-old Wesley had no personal connection to Sam Herr, police decided to turn their attention back to Dan. The bail bondsman's story just sounded like a total fabrication. They now suspected that Daniel might be helping Sam get money and that Dan might even be hiding or covering for his friend. But tracking down Dan for a second interview turned out to be much more difficult than the police expected. When they finally reached Dan on his cell phone and asked him to come into the Costa Mesa police station for another interview, Dan was evasive. He wanted to help, but he was busy. It was the final week of the play 9, in which he and Rachel had starring roles. They were also just days away from getting married, and when they weren't rehearsing or on stage, they were busy with last-minute wedding plans. Frustrated, detectives decided not to wait any longer. On the evening of May 25th, just 3 days after Julie's murder, detectives crashed Dan's bachelor party. They found Dan, dressed in his trademark khaki pants and Hawaiian shirt, at a suburban Japanese restaurant named Tsunami in Huntington Beach. Guns drawn, police entered through both the front and back doors. That way, no one could get out of the restaurant without being seen. At about 10 p.m., in front of his stunned group of friends, police snapped handcuffs on Dan and charged him with accessory to murder. Dan was completely shocked, and the color in his face just completely drained. But once Dan was inside the police station, his demeanor changed. He suddenly seemed somewhat composed and told police that he wanted to tell them what his real connection to Sam Herr was. Sitting in a plastic chair in the corner of the small interrogation room, Dan took a deep breath and then came clean. He told police that the whole bail bondsman thing that the 16-year-old kid was involved in was indeed a fabrication. It was a cover for a credit card scam that he and Sam were in on together. The way it worked was Wesley, the 16-year-old, would make a series of large cash withdrawals using Sam's bank cards, and then Sam would put in a claim with his bank saying he never authorized the withdrawals. This, of course, allowed Sam and Daniel to keep the cash Wesley had taken out, as well as the reimbursement money they would get from the bank. Wesley did not realize this was going on. He thought this was all legit, and he really was working for Daniel, who was working with a bail bondsman, and Wesley thought he was just getting some free pizza out of it. His mother was also unaware of this scam. The police proceeded to ask Daniel the same questions they had asked before when they spoke to him at the apartment, and Daniel gave the same answers. The last time he saw Sam was on that Friday afternoon, shortly before he saw him walk off with some guy in a black hat, and then that night, Daniel and his fiancée Rachel had been at their theater performing in their musical called 9. But then something odd happened. About 30 minutes into this interrogation, Daniel suddenly completely changed his story. The police were so caught off guard that they really didn't even interrupt. They just let him speak. 1 minute, Daniel was talking about this credit card fraud scam, and then the next minute, without missing a beat, Dan told detectives that, well, in fact, Friday afternoon had not been the last time he had seen Sam. In his new version of events, Dan told police that in the very early hours of Saturday, May 22nd, Sam had knocked on the door of Dan and Rachel's apartment. When Dan got out of bed and walked through his darkened living room and opened the door, he saw his friend standing in the doorway looking totally frantic and disheveled. Sam immediately told Dan that something horrible had just happened and that the two of them were in trouble and they needed to get the F out of there as soon as possible. Dan, who thought this must have something to do with their credit card scam, immediately stepped back into his apartment and, being careful not to wake up Rachel, put on his clothes. A few minutes later, he and Sam were driving Sam's car south to the Long Beach Town Center Mall where Sam had asked to be dropped off. And it was during that drive that Daniel heard exactly what the horrible thing was that had just happened. And it had nothing to do with a credit card scam. Sam went on to tell Dan that Julie was in his apartment and that he had killed her. Dan told police Sam's exact words. "I shot somebody. It was a fit of rage. I was doing some heavy drugs. I'm not happy about it, but she had it coming." The two detectives looked at each other. This was exactly the break in the case that they had been hoping for. Daniel's story had just confirmed their own reconstruction of the crime. Now they hoped that Dan could help them locate their killer, Sam. According to Dan, he had no idea where Sam was or where he was going, and that before they parted ways, before Sam got out at that mall, he had threatened Dan and told him that if he went to police and ratted him out, that Sam would come back and kill him, or he'd come back and he would kill his fiancée Rachel. And so when police had questioned Dan and Rachel the day after the murder had been discovered, Dan had panicked and lied to police in order to protect himself and his fiancée. He told police there was no man in a black hat, that he had made that up. At this point in the interrogation, Daniel was a wreck, and he just repeatedly apologized to police for misleading them. But despite Dan's sincerity, the police were now concerned that he might be hiding even more information about Sam, and so they decided to apply some pressure. At 11:43 p.m., about 1 hour into this interrogation, police asked Dan if he would give them permission to take a DNA swab. That way they could confirm that Dan was never present at the actual crime scene. Right away, Dan agreed. At this point, he was extremely eager to do anything he could to remove himself from the suspect list. As soon as the detective finished taking the swab out of Dan's mouth, the video camera inside of the interrogation room captures Dan's very obvious sense of relief. It was clear as he started to check his pockets and put his cup of coffee down on the floor that Dan thought this whole thing was over. The interview was over, he had done the swab, and now he could leave. But just seconds later, as the detective who had taken the DNA swab peeled off his gloves, the other detective asked Dan where exactly in Sam's apartment were police investigators likely to find Dan's DNA. Since Dan was a regular visitor in Sam's apartment, if they were going to use his DNA to rule him out as a suspect, they needed to know what Dan had already touched. And this question seemed to startle Dan. The camera footage showed him running his hands through his thick black hair, and for the first time, Dan looks kind of nervous, but he does tell police that they are likely to find his DNA in both the bathroom and perhaps out on the patio. Those are the two places he would go inside of Sam's apartment. After Dan says this, one of the detectives asks Dan point blank, "Did you see Julie's body inside of Sam's apartment?" Dan practically shouted that he had not. That all he knew about the murder was what Sam had told him in the car on the way to the mall that night. But the detectives, noticing that Daniel was really starting to fall apart and act nervous, they decided to ramp up the pressure by bluffing. Leaning forward towards Dan, who was now leaning back in his chair, one of the detectives asked Dan, "So, if you claim you were only in Sam's bathroom and patio, then why did we find your DNA inside of Sam's bedroom near Julie's body?" Now, keep in mind, they had no way of knowing if his DNA was inside of that apartment. They wouldn't have known for weeks. But Dan didn't know that. He thinks what they're telling him is factual. And as soon as they said this to him, Daniel changed his story again. Looking totally defeated, Dan slumped down in his chair and he said, Okay, I'll tell you. This is what really happened. According to Dan, when Sam arrived at his apartment in the early morning hours of Saturday, May 22nd, and told Dan they needed to get the F out of there, before they got in the car and drove away, Sam had told Daniel what he had done and then took Daniel up to his apartment and actually showed him Julie's body. At this point in the interview, the cameras showed Dan back on his feet, pacing across the small windowless room. He's agitated and he's running his fingers through his hair. And for the next 3 hours, the two detectives pressed for more details about exactly what Dan had seen in Sam's bedroom. By 2 a.m. on Thursday, May 27th, Dan had been talking, yelling, and sometimes whispering to police for 4 straight hours. He was exhausted, and since he was getting married in now less than 48 hours, he was desperate to just wrap this up so he could go. So at 2:17 a.m., Daniel, who had been caught completely between a rock and a hard place, between trying to protect his friend or telling the cops everything he knew, seemed to crack. "Yes," he finally shouted at detectives. "Yes, I saw her goddamn body. Is that what you want to hear? I saw 2 gunshots in her head." Both detectives suddenly went completely still and looked at each other. They also looked up at the camera that was recording the interview and playing it live in an adjoining room where a third detective was watching it. All 3 detectives were thinking the exact same thing. Dan Wozniak had just given them a critical new piece of information. Based on what would stretch into a 14-hour interrogation of Daniel Wozniak and an investigation into the new evidence police would uncover based on what he told them, this is the reconstruction of what happened to 23-year-old Julie Kibuishi and how police were finally able to locate their prime suspect, Sam Her. Back on the evening of Friday, May 21st, about half an hour after Julie had left that Thai restaurant in Newport Beach where she was having dinner with her older brother Taka, Julie pulled into the parking lot next to the Camden Martinique apartments where she had agreed to meet her friend Sam Herr. Although she was still wearing the sparkly tiara that her brother had just given her, Julie's mood had turned serious. Before heading into Sam's apartment, she scrolled one more time through the dozens of text messages he had sent her starting that afternoon. They all seemed so strange and out of character for Sam, but she knew Sam dealt with some very serious night terrors from his time in Afghanistan, and for all she knew, he could be having some sort of breakdown right now that was Afghanistan related. So, believing Sam really just needed a friend right now, she put her phone away, got out of her car, and made her way over to the stairs that would take her up to his apartment. When she reached the floor his apartment was on, she saw Daniel standing outside of it. It turned out Dan had become worried about Sam too when Sam had not been responding to his knocks on his door. Dan told Julie he did have a spare key and thought, maybe the two of them should just go inside and see what was going on. Grateful for the company, Julie waited a minute after Dan had unlocked the door and walked inside, then she followed Dan into the apartment. There was no sign of Sam, but a few seconds later, Julie, who was standing in the front area of the apartment, she heard a terrified-sounding Dan call out from Sam's bedroom in the back of the apartment. She asked what was going on, and Dan just called out, "You'd better come in here, there's something in his bed that you need to see." And so Julie began walking towards the bedroom. Several hours earlier, Daniel had called Sam and asked him to go with him to one of the small community theaters where Dan often performed. It was called the Liberty Theater and was located about 30 minutes north of their apartment complex. Daniel needed help moving a heavy piece of set furniture that was wanted by another local community theater. Sam agreed, and the two met outside in the parking lot of their apartment building. Then they hopped into Sam's car and they headed north. Once they arrived, Dan led Sam through the empty theater, and when they were backstage, they climbed a flight of stairs to the second floor, and then once they were up there, Dan pointed out a dusty wooden ladder that led up to the attic. So up they went, and as soon as they were up there, Dan quickly walked over to this big piece of furniture and signaled to Sam that that was it. That was the piece they were going to move. Sam nodded and moved past Daniel and took up a spot next to him, kind of crouching down to get a good grip underneath this big piece of furniture. Little did Sam know that his friend, Daniel, who was now standing behind him, could not have cared less about moving furniture. Instead, Dan was quietly pulling out a .38 caliber semi-automatic pistol. And then once it was out, he aimed the pistol carefully at the back of Sam's head, and then he pulled the trigger. For a moment, all Dan could hear was the echo of the shot reverberating around the attic. And then Sam, who was still alive, turned to look up at his friend. Sam whispered, "I need help. I need help. Something hit me. I think I've been electrocuted." Looking directly into Sam Herr's eyes, Dan raised the pistol and pulled the trigger a second time. Except the weapon didn't fire. It jammed. So while Sam is laying there staring up at Daniel with a look of horror on his face, Daniel calmly pulled the slide back of the pistol. He cleared the jammed round out of the gun. He reloaded the gun and then placed the gun up against Sam's temple and pulled the trigger again. This time, the gun did fire, and this time Sam would die. Then Dan, stepping carefully to avoid the blood that was spreading out across the floor, bent over Sam's body and removed his phone, and rifling through his friend's wallet, Dan pulled out Sam's passport and Sam's ATM and credit cards. Flipping Sam's phone open, Dan began to send what would be a long string of text messages to Julie. Each one was carefully scripted to draw her to Sam's apartment later that night and to look to an outsider as though Sam was in the midst of a personal crisis and that he and Julie were somehow romantically involved. Leaving Sam's body where it had fallen, Dan climbed back down the wooden ladder, down the flight of stairs to the ground level, left the empty theater, and got into Sam's car. But before going back to his apartment, Dan picked up the 16-year-old Wesley Freilich, and they made their first withdrawal using Sam's ATM card. Once he had returned to the Camden Martinique apartments, Dan had just enough time to shower, change his clothes, and send Julie yet another round of strange text messages from Sam's phone. I need to talk to you. Can you come here around midnight? Please, come alone, please. A little while later, when Dan arrived at the Hungry Artists Theater for the final showing of the play he was in called 9, this was not the same theater where hours earlier he had killed Sam, his fellow actors would report that Dan showed no sign of any stage jitters. Instead, he gave what some of his colleagues described as the best performance of his life, playing opposite his beautiful bride-to-be, Rachel Buffett. After the performance, Dan stood for a moment backstage by himself and checked Sam's phone. Once he saw that Julie had agreed to meet Sam at midnight, Dan smiled. Then he stepped back into the group of friends who were all congratulating him on his great performance. Then he and Rachel headed home, where Dan would shower yet again. He would have sex with Rachel, and then he would tell her he was stepping outside just to go for a little walk. In reality, he was making his way over to Sam's apartment to wait for Julie. At midnight, Julie arrived, and then when they both went inside and Dan went into the back bedroom and called out for Julie, Dan did, in fact, have something he wanted Julie to look at in the bed, but not because there was anything for her to actually see. Once Julie had walked into the bedroom and put her bag down and stood in front of the bed, not seeing anything on it, Daniel reached around her and pointed at the center of the bed and told her she needed to look closer to see what he was talking about. And so confused, Julie leaned forward, looking at the center of the bed where there was nothing. And as she did that, Dan pulled out the same pistol he'd used to kill Sam earlier in the day, and he aimed it at Julie, and he fired 2 shots into Julie's head, hitting her just below the tiara that was now tangled in her blood-soaked hair. Moving quickly, Dan arranged the scene as he would any other stage set. Using scissors he had brought with him, Dan cut through the waistband of Julie's jeans, pulling them down around her hips to make it look like she had been sexually assaulted. Then he took a black magic marker and wrote, "All yours, F.U." on the back of her sweater. Satisfied that he had created the perfect frame job that would have police chasing down Sam Herr as Julie's murderer, and knowing police would never find Sam, Dan backed away from Julie's mangled and bleeding body and returned to his own apartment, where he showered yet again. The next day, Dan returned to the Liberty Theater where he had killed Sam. This time, he brought an axe and that same pair of scissors with him. Returning to the attic, Dan used the scissors to cut off Sam's clothes, and he used the axe to dismember Sam's body. Dan left Sam's naked and headless body upstairs in the theater, but using plastic bags he had picked up at a nearby cafe, Dan packed up Sam's head and hands and one arm and stuffed them into a backpack. Then, Dan left the theater, drove to the El Dorado Nature Center 3 miles away, and there he scattered Sam's remains in shallow openings he found or dug near the bases of trees and under bushes. Then, Dan, who was so far behind on his rent he would soon be evicted from the Camden Martinique apartments, and who desperately needed money to pay for his upcoming honeymoon, headed for the ATMs where he would meet Wesley Freilich and collect another $400 installment of Sam Herr's combat pay. It is possible that Daniel might have gotten away with the brutal murders of Sam and Julie, but in those early morning hours of May 27th in the Costa Mesa police station, at about 2 a.m., when Dan was asked by detectives what specifically he had seen when he looked at Julie's body sprawled out on Sam's bed, Daniel Wozniak delivered exactly the wrong line. "I saw 2 gunshots in her head." All 3 of the police officers who were listening to that interview knew that anyone who was just looking at Julie's body, like Dan claimed he was doing, they would only have been able to tell there was a single wound. It would not have looked like 2 distinct gunshot wounds. So the only way Daniel could have known that there were 2 gunshots in Julie's head was if he had fired those shots himself. So when he still kept denying any involvement, the police told Dan they knew he was lying and they put him into a jail cell. They reminded him he was under arrest for being an accessory to murder, and the only way he'd be leaving is when he told them everything he really knew about Julie's murder. And then the following afternoon, at about 1:15 p.m., Dan would further implicate himself during a conversation he had from the jail with his fiancée Rachel Buffett. By then, Rachel knew Dan had been arrested. She had also found out from Dan's brother, Tim, that Dan had given Tim a backpack filled with bloody clothes and a .38 caliber pistol, Sam's passport, phone, wallet, and 2 spent shell casings. Instead of destroying the bag as Dan had told him to, Tim had just thrown the backpack over the fence behind their parents' house. When Rachel told Dan on the phone in a call that was recorded by police that she was going to tell the detectives what she knew, including the existence of this backpack, Dan whispered into the receiver, "Then I'm doomed." 30 minutes after this phone call with Rachel, Daniel would signal to police that he was ready to confess to what he did. The cameras show him sitting at a small table in the interrogation room, elbows on the table, head resting in his hands. Yes, he had murdered Sam because he wanted that $62,000 in combat pay that Sam had saved from his deployment to Afghanistan. And yes, he had murdered Julie just as a decoy, a way to mislead police into thinking that Sam had disappeared because Sam was not a war hero, but rather a killer who had gone on the run after murdering Julie in a fit of rage or jealousy. When asked by police why he did it, Daniel told them, "I'm crazy. It was always all about the money." Following Dan's confession, police searched the Liberty Theater and found Sam's badly decomposed partial remains. The only way to recognize the torso as belonging to Sam was the heart tattooed on his chest that was inscribed with the words Mom and Dad. On May 29th, the day Sam Herr would have turned 27 years old, police found his head, hands, and one of his arms scattered throughout El Dorado Nature Center. More than 5 years later, on December 16, 2015, Daniel Wozniak was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. At the penalty hearing in September 2016, Daniel was sentenced to death. 3 years later, a separate jury found Dan Wozniak's ex-fiancée Rachel Buffett to be an accessory after the fact, after further investigation revealed that she had lied to police to cover up her possible involvement in the crime and to protect her then-fiancé Daniel Wozniak. As for the families of the victims, June Kibuishi wonders if she had taught her children, especially Julie, to be too kind. And for Steve Herr, the thought of his son's final moments will haunt him for the rest of his life. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please sneak in to the 5-star review button's home and turn the batteries in every remote in the wrong direction. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Today's story is the remastered audio from Her Evil Plan Put Her on Death Row, which is a very popular video on my YouTube channel. My telling of this story gained notoriety on YouTube largely because of the intimate detail I put into the death scene. It's like you're getting a front row seat to one of the most heinous crimes in recent history. As such, listener discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please go into the 5-star review button's favorite music playlist and replace all of the songs with the Kids Bop versions of them. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early 1960s, 2 high school classmates in South Carolina, named Carol and Reggie, fell in love with each other. Every day in the halls, they'd hold hands and they'd laugh with each other and whisper to each other, and then outside of school, they were inseparable. But despite their seemingly perfect relationship, it didn't last long. They both had different ideas about what the future should hold, and so after graduation, they broke up. Reggie went on to join the US Navy, where he served for a number of years all over the world. He would at one point get married, but that marriage would end quickly. And then after he got out of the military, he got a job at a railroad back at his hometown in South Carolina. As for Carol, after graduation, she got married and divorced too, twice actually, but it was her second failed marriage that nearly killed her. On February 18, 1987, Carol was living with her 10-year-old daughter Rhonda in South Carolina when her estranged second husband came up to the door and knocked. Carol opened the door, and her ex-husband drew a gun and shot her 6 times in front of her daughter before turning around and fleeing. The police would later find his body inside of his car on the side of the road. He had shot himself. As for Carol, the doctors were able to save her life, but the injuries she sustained from the attack were crippling. She was blind in one eye and she had chronic pain, and so her young daughter had to start taking care of her full time. Over the next 8 years, Carol steadily improved and regained some of her independence, but in 1995 she had a huge setback. She started feeling ill, and so she went in to see a doctor, and the doctor did a blood test and they discovered she had liver cancer. It would turn out the blood that was given to her after the attack that had been transfused into her body to save her life, it had been tainted with hepatitis C. And so she got hepatitis C without realizing it, and because it had been untreated, it led to liver cancer. Rhonda remembers when her mother came home after being given this terrible news, she just sat down and was silent for a minute, and then she just kind of muttered to herself, "I just can't get away from this man. He's killing me all over again." But despite being dealt such an unfair hand in life, Carol was determined to not let her injuries or her illness define her. And so she went out looking for a job that could accommodate her physical limitations, and she found it. She was hired as a part-time customer service rep for a television cable company. She was very happy about this job and very proud of it because it was the first time she was working after the attack, and so for once it felt like her life was going back to normal again. A few years later, in 2000, when Carol was working at the cable company, her phone rang and she answered it the way she answered every other call, but the voice she heard on the other end, she immediately recognized. He introduced himself as Reggie Sumner, and so Carol asked him, "Are you the Reggie Sumner from 1962 at Garrett High School in South Carolina?" And he said, "Yeah, that's me." And Carol said, "I'm your ex-girlfriend. We dated in high school." And so it was this incredible reunion, this totally chance phone call, and for the next hour or so, they just chatted on the phone about everything from their kids, to their relationships they've been in, to what they're up to now. I mean, they had a lot to catch up on since they hadn't seen or heard from each other in nearly 40 years. And so before they hung up, they realized they lived near each other, and so they made plans to get together in person. Rhonda would say her mother, when she came home that night, was like a 16-year-old girl all over again. She talked endlessly about how great Reggie was and how good-looking he was and how excited she was about their upcoming date. And so a couple of days later, Carol and Reggie have this date, and when Carol comes home, Rhonda would say it was obvious her mother had fallen head over heels in love with Reggie all over again. And luckily, Reggie had fallen in love with Carol too, because less than 6 months later, they got married and became Mr. and Mrs. Sumner. Within a year of their marriage, they decided to sell their home in South Carolina and move to Jacksonville, Florida to retire. Even though caring for her mother for all those years had been quite difficult for Rhonda, she said she was very sad to see her mother go, but at the same time, she was really happy for her because it seemed like she had found the one. Over the next couple of years, Rhonda stayed in touch with her mother, speaking to her almost every single day on the phone. But in July of 2005, Rhonda's mother stopped answering her phone. At first, Rhonda wasn't that concerned, but after 24 hours of not hearing from her mother or from Reggie, she did get concerned. Because even though Reggie was able to care for Carol, he wasn't in the best shape himself. He had debilitating diabetes, and he had recently broken his leg, and so was largely confined to a wheelchair. And so if they were to leave their house for an extended period of time, they wouldn't do it without asking for help from Rhonda. And so over the next couple of days, Rhonda incessantly called her mother and called Reggie, but she never got through to them. And so finally, after almost 72 hours of not hearing from them, she decides to just hop in her car and drive the 4 hours to Jacksonville to check on them personally. When she got there, she saw her mother and Reggie's car was not in the driveway like it normally would be. And so Rhonda went up to the front door and she knocked and she's yelling for her mom, but nobody's coming to the door, even though lights are on inside the house. And so Rhonda eventually tries the handle of the door and it's open. And so she opens it up, she steps inside, she yells again for her mom and for Reggie, but no one yells back. And then she sees their beloved dog, Mikey, that they brought everywhere with them, was still in the house. And so she's thinking, where would they have gone without bringing Mikey? And so Rhonda continues to walk through the house into the kitchen, and when she gets there, she sees on the table are 2 plates of food where the food looks like it's a couple of days old, and it's just sitting on the plate like they had been eating it and then just abandoned it there. And then in the sink are all these dirty dishes, and then on the stove are half-cooked pots of food. And Rhonda knows her mother is an extremely tidy person, and she never would have left her house with dirty dishes and food out on the table. And so red flags are going up for Rhonda, but what ultimately sealed the deal for her was when she turned and looked on one of the counters, she saw the cell phone that Reggie and Carol shared was still sitting there along with Carol's purse, and then next to that was both of their medications, which was Reggie's insulin and Carol's liver cancer medication, both of which were life-saving and needed to be taken every single day. There's no way they would have left the house without those things. And so Rhonda immediately calls the Jacksonville Police Department and she files a missing person report. And before long, the missing couple's story is all over the news, and all of the networks are asking people if they have information to come forward. But no one came forward, and so the only lead the police had was to track down the Sumners' car, which was missing from their driveway when Rhonda showed up at their house. So the police shared the description of their vehicle all across the state, and very quickly they got a hit. The car had been found abandoned in a Florida town about 1 hour west of Jacksonville. It had been parked in this semi-forested, very secluded area off of a dirt road, and there was nothing inside of it, but they saw the battery had been taken out, leading some of the officers to speculate that perhaps the Sumners really had just driven away from their home without telling anybody and then ran into car troubles. But that theory would quickly be thrown out the window when 5 hours later, the Jacksonville police received a very strange phone call. The man who called in said he was Reggie Sumner, and he said he had seen the news about him and his wife being missing and that was just totally not true, that in reality they had left, but they were just fine and they'd be back soon. The police are immediately suspicious of this person. They don't think it's Reggie Sumner because, for one, he sounds like a young man and Reggie is a 61-year-old, and so the voice didn't really line up. And just the way he was talking about this disappearance like it was no big deal, that also just didn't really make sense. And so one of the officers asked Reggie, "Are you with your wife, Carol?" And he said, "Yep, I'm with her, here she is." And so a woman hops on the phone who says she's Carol Sumner, but she sounds far too young to be Carol Sumner, who's 61. This sounds like a 18, 19, 20-year-old girl. And she too just reiterates that everything's just fine and they've gone out for a couple of days, there's nothing to worry about, and you police can stop looking for us. And so after this call ends, the police at this point are convinced that this simply cannot be Carol and Reggie. But to make sure, they call in Rhonda and they have her listen to the recording of this conversation with the so-called Reggie and Carol. And right away, Rhonda says, "That's not my mom and that's not Reggie." And so at this point, the police assumed that these 2 people who called in pretending to be the Sumners probably had something to do with the disappearance of the real Sumners. And so while they waited for the trace on this phone call to come back, which would give them information about who was calling and from where, the police decided to investigate another angle. The police looked at the Sumners' bank statements, and they saw their bank card had been used at an ATM in South Carolina after the Sumners had been reported missing. And so they called that bank and they asked for the CCTV footage from that ATM, and when they watched it, they saw that it was not Carol or Reggie Sumner withdrawing funds, it was some unknown man in his early 20s. Right after this discovery of this unknown man, the trace from the phone conversation with the imposter Sumners came back, except it was tied to a fake name at a fake address. So that wasn't helpful to the police in their investigation. However, when they went through this cell phone's call logs, which they got with the phone trace, they saw whoever owned the cell phone had recently placed a call to a car rental company in South Carolina. And so the police call this car rental company and they speak to the manager and they're able to figure out that somebody using this cell phone number had indeed called and had rented a car, and the car they rented matched the description of the car the unknown man was driving in the ATM surveillance footage. But this car had been rented to a woman. Her name was Tiffany Cole. The rental company told police that all of their cars had satellite tracking information built into them. And so police were able to use that information to track Tiffany's rental car to a motel in South Carolina. The initial thought was that maybe the Sumners are being held against their will in this motel. And so very quickly, a police force was organized, and on the morning of July 14th, so 6 days after the Sumners were listed as missing, they arrive at this motel, they go to the front desk, they find out what room Tiffany is in, they get the key, and they go up and they open the door. The Sumners were not inside. Instead, there were 3 young adults sitting there. It was 24-year-old Tiffany Cole, her boyfriend, 23-year-old Michael James Jackson, and his friend, 19-year-old Alan Wade. Also in the room were dozens of bags of recently purchased merchandise, like computers and video games and clothes and perfume. And also they discovered the key to the Sumner's vehicle and Reggie Sumner's prized coin collection. The police brought all three back to the police station and put them in separate rooms to be interrogated. At this point, it was obvious to police that these three had something to do with the Sumner's disappearance. They had all these things in the room that tied them to the missing couple. And so now the police, as they interrogated them, it was not so much about connecting them to the Sumners as much as it was about helping them find the Sumners. At first, all three of them either didn't talk or were totally uncooperative. But under intense questioning, Tiffany cracked a little bit. She said that they had robbed the Sumners, but nothing more. They didn't do anything else besides rob them. And there had been a fourth person involved in the robbery, 19-year-old Bruce Nixon, who was friends with Alan Wade. Bruce lived nearby, so the police quickly rounded him up and brought him in for questioning, and unlike the other three, Bruce immediately caved. And the story he told about what happened to the Sumners brought many of the police that were involved in this investigation to tears. He said it all started with Tiffany. Tiffany used to be neighbors with the Sumners back when they still lived in South Carolina. Tiffany had a pretty rough upbringing and her father was permanently sick, and so the Sumners kind of took her under their wing and looked after her and built a very close relationship with her and kind of treated her like she was one of their daughters. Anything she needed, if she needed money, food, anything, they would give it to her. For example, in 2001, right before they left for Florida, they sold a car to Tiffany, but they sold it for basically nothing because they knew she didn't have any money and she really needed a car. 4 years later, in June of 2005, Tiffany was partying in Jacksonville, Florida with her new boyfriend, Michael James Jackson, when they got kicked out of the house they planned on staying in for the night. And so now they don't have a place to stay, they don't have any money, and that's when Tiffany remembers the Sumners had moved to Jacksonville and they would always help her out if she needed anything. And so the two of them drive to the Sumners' house in the middle of the night, they haven't called them, and they just knock on the door, totally uninvited. And Carol comes to the door, and when she opens it, she sees Tiffany, and immediately she's like, "Oh my goodness, I haven't seen you in so long. Come in, come in. Who are you? Oh, Michael, great to meet you. Come on inside, I'll get you food. We'll get you fed. What do you need? What can we do for you?" And so that's when Tiffany explains to them that their plans had kind of fallen through, and they didn't have a place to stay that night, and would it be possible to stay with them? And so Carol and Reggie right away say, "Absolutely no problem. Tiffany, Michael, you guys are guests here. You're welcome. Stay as long as you want." And so that night, Carol cooked a big meal for them and they all sat down at the table. And at some point, Carol and Reggie talk about the sale of their house in South Carolina. And somehow it came up that they had made $99,000 in profit from this sale. And they were so happy about it because now they could really retire comfortably. And so as soon as they said that, Tiffany and Michael shot glances at each other because they knew they had to come back and rob them. The next morning, Carol and Reggie got up early, they made coffee and they made breakfast, and they were hoping that Tiffany and Michael would stick around for the day and spend some more time with them. But Tiffany and Michael were very quick to want to leave. They said, "Thank you very much, we gotta hit the road," and so they left. And as soon as they get in the car, they start planning how they're gonna come back and rob the Sumners and get their hands on that $99,000. 1 month later, on the evening of July 8th, after all robbery preparations have been made, Bruce Nixon and Alan Wade show up at the Sumner house and they knock on the door. When the door opens, it's Carol, and she doesn't recognize either of them, but being as kind and generous as she was, she said, "Hey boys, what can I do for you? How can I help you?" And this was exactly what Bruce and Alan were expecting based on what Tiffany told them. She said this couple would be very easy to exploit. And they tell her that their car had broken down and they needed to use her phone. And so she's a little bit skeptical, but ultimately she says, "Sure, come on in." And so Bruce and Alan go inside the house, the door shuts behind them, and as soon as it does, one of them draws a fake gun that looks very real and pointed it at Carol, while the other one began tying her up with cord and with duct tape. And so Carol begins screaming and making a bunch of noise, and Reggie, who's in the garage out of sight, he hears her. He comes running in to see what's going on, and he sees these two men who immediately attack him, and Reggie's got a broken leg, and he's already pretty weak and frail, and so he doesn't put up much of a fight. And before long, he and his wife were all taped up and restrained on the couch, and they were having duct tape wrapped around their heads until everything was covered except for a slit underneath their nose so they could breathe. And so with the couple completely under control and at the mercy of their captors, one of the men texted Michael, who was down the road with Tiffany inside of Tiffany's rental car, and the text just said, "All clear." And what that meant was Michael could now come up and help them rob the house. And so Tiffany stays down the road in the rental car. Michael makes his way up. He goes inside, and he, Bruce, and Alan proceeded to ransack the house. And while these three men are moving room to room, taking all of their valuables, Reggie and Carol are probably thinking to themselves that, you know what, this is awful, we're getting robbed, but after they take whatever they take and they leave, we'll be fine, we'll recover. But when these three men finished taking all of their valuable items, they decided that they would also take Reggie and Carol. So they stood the couple up and they marched them into the garage and they put them in the trunk of their own car. At this point, Bruce left the Sumner's house and went down the road and got in Tiffany's rental car, and Michael and Alan, they got into the Sumner's car, and the two cars met up on the road and then drove 40 minutes northwest just over the border into Georgia, where they found this access road and they went down it until they reached this very secluded section of forest. This was not just some random spot in the middle of the woods in Georgia. This was a pre-selected spot that Tiffany and the others had been out to 2 days earlier to prepare it. And what they had done to prepare was to dig a grave for the Sumners. Michael and Alan, in the Sumner's car, drove up right next to the gravesite, while Tiffany and Bruce came up right behind them. And once they had all stopped, they got out of the car and they went right behind the Sumner's car and they popped open the trunk. It's believed the temperature inside of that trunk was well over 100 degrees. And so Reggie and Carol were sweating profusely, and the sweat had caused their restraints to slip off their wrists and slip down off their face. And so the two of them were found holding on to each other and crying and praying. Seeing how weak they already were, the group decided they did not need to put new tape around their wrists or their face. They weren't going to go anywhere. And so they grabbed the two and they pulled them out and dumped them on the ground. It was probably around this time that the Sumners realized Tiffany was one of these four people that was doing this horrible thing to them. And I can only imagine the heartbreak they experienced. This girl that they took in under their wing, that they thought of as a daughter, was betraying them in such a heinous and horrible way. But there was no time to feel upset about it, because as soon as they were dumped on the ground, Michael grabbed Reggie and kind of threw him over to the side and said, "Sit down, don't move, or I'm going to kill you and your wife." And then the others grabbed Carol and dragged her away from her husband over to the edge of the grave, where they literally ripped the jewelry off of her face and off of her body. And then after all the jewelry was gone, they pushed her into the grave. Then they walked over to Reggie and dragged him over and threw him in with his wife. As soon as the couple was in the grave together, they repositioned themselves so they were both sitting up, one in front of the other, with Carol behind Reggie, and she threw her legs and her arms around Reggie, just kind of clutching onto him, and she buried her head into his back and she began crying. The original plan, apparently, had been to take the Sumners and put them in this grave and pretend like you were going to do something to them, to scare them into giving up all of their information, all of their banking information, and anything else that was valuable. And it worked. And so as Carol is crying into Reggie's back, Reggie is pleading with the group. He's pleading to them, "Let me give you everything I have. Whatever you need, it's yours." And so Michael said, "Give me all your ATM bank card numbers, give me your PIN numbers, everything." And so Reggie did. He gave him all the information he could possibly give to him. And then, for some reason, despite the fact that at this point, the group has taken everything of value from this poor couple, they have extracted all the valuable information they could possibly get from them. Despite that, they decide that that's not enough. They need to kill the Sumners. And they need to kill them in the worst way imaginable. They need to bury them alive. For hours, the group slowly, shovelful by shovelful, filled in this hole with Reggie and Carol sitting at the bottom begging for their lives. But the group didn't care at all. They just kept shoveling dirt down on top of them until the dirt and mud had gotten up to their necks, and the weight of the dirt was pressing in on their chests and was making it really hard to breathe. And so as Carol and Reggie are feeling this happening to them, they can feel themselves being crushed under this weight. Their cries for help become more and more desperate, but more spaced apart, because their breathing at this point is so labored, it's so hard to get a full breath that they're conserving their air at this point. And then at some point, as the dirt crept closer and closer to their mouths, they had to tilt their heads up to try to get a good breath of air. But when they did that, they began shoveling dirt directly onto their faces, causing them to choke and gag. They're inhaling this, and it's becoming nearly impossible to catch a breath. They're dying at this point. And so finally, another layer of dirt was thrown on top of them, and they disappeared under the soil. But their sounds didn't go away. They continued to whimper and make sounds as more and more dirt was put down, until finally they had filled in the hole, and they began packing the dirt down with the backs of their shovels. And they could hear underneath the soil still the sounds of this couple dying. This was a slow and horrible death. After the killers were done, they left the site and they took the Sumner's car and they dumped it in Florida where it was ultimately found. And then they all piled into the rental car. They went to an ATM and pulled some of the Sumner's money out and then went on a spending spree. During that spending spree, Tiffany would pose for several pictures in the back of the rental car. In these photos, Tiffany is all smiles and clearly having a wonderful time, despite the fact that literally just hours earlier she had killed the very people who had taken her in and treated her like a daughter. If you want to see those pictures, just Google the words Tiffany Cole celebrating. After their autopsies, the medical examiner explained that both Reggie and Carol had dirt packed into their nose, into their mouths, in their throats, in their stomach, and in their lungs, meaning their actual cause of death was being buried alive. In exchange for telling investigators what happened and for leading them to the gravesite where the Sumners were, Bruce Nixon was spared the death penalty and given a life sentence. As for Michael, Alan, and Tiffany, they were all sentenced to death. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please go into the 5-star review button's favorite music playlist and replace all of the songs with the Kids Bop versions of them. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, and everywhere else you get your podcasts. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories I have posted on my YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username on all these platforms is just @MrBallen. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So, that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. This story is about a baffling disappearance that happened in 2020 in a forest in California. But the most unique part of this disappearance is the incredibly spooky twist that happened very recently. This twist is something that the Madera County Sheriff's Office, who is in charge of investigating this disappearance, they're still trying to wrap their head around what even happened. Today's story is the remastered audio from Blue-Haired Woman Terrifies Authorities, which is a very popular video on our main YouTube channel. The link to the original YouTube video is in the description. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please sign the 5-star review button up for your very casual, very friendly, slow machine pitch baseball league. But when it's their turn at bat, switch the machine out for a grenade launcher. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared that the COVID-19 outbreak was so bad that it had become a global pandemic, which meant this new highly infectious disease had spread virtually everywhere on the planet. And so around the time this global pandemic announcement was made, governments around the world began instructing their citizens to stay home and avoid all physical contact with other people outside of the people that you lived with. The idea being these quarantine measures would help stop the spread of the virus. Initially, world leaders and citizens believed these quarantine measures would have a dramatic impact and it would stop the spread, and before long, COVID would be under control and life would just kind of magically go back to normal. But unfortunately, that is not what happened. By June, so 3 months into the global pandemic, positive COVID cases were only going up, not down. And so it was around that point in June that people all over the world were starting to come to terms with the reality that COVID was not this simple problem with a simple solution, It was a complex health issue that likely was going to be around for a long time, which also meant these strict quarantine measures also would likely be around for some time. Now, the efficacy of these quarantine measures were quickly called into question, and it was all over the news, and politicians, all they wanted to talk about was, do these measures work? Is it having an effect on the spread of the virus? But for everyday people, the real concern was not politics, it was practicality. How do you live a full and happy life in quarantine? In June of that year, 54-year-old Sandra Hughes was pondering that question. To that point, her life had really not gone the way she had planned it. She had been married, twice actually, but both relationships had ended in divorce, and she had never had children. She lived in beautiful Maui, Hawaii, but she hadn't really lived there long enough to consider it her home, and prior to that, for the bulk of her adult life, she'd kind of lived this nomad lifestyle, bouncing around all over the country, and so really she had never developed a home of sorts. She was an accountant by trade, but in college, she had studied not just accounting, but also wilderness survival, which she happened to be incredible at and was very passionate about. Growing up, she had always been a big outdoor enthusiast, and so she had always thought one day she would become a park ranger, and so that's why she was studying wilderness survival in college. But as these things go, after she graduated college, she did not become a park ranger, she became an accountant, and now, 30 years later, here she was. However, in June of that year, with COVID quarantine restrictions putting her and everyone else's life basically on pause, Sandra suddenly saw an opportunity, and that was to embrace this break from reality and spend this strange time in history back out in nature, getting back in touch with her roots as an outdoor survivalist. And so at the end of that June, Sandra would sell her place in Maui and she would move to Madera County, California, which is located smack dab in the center of California, situated just south of Yosemite National Park and just north of the Sierra National Forest. Then, on June 26th, after Sandra had gotten settled in her new place in California, she would contact her family and tell them that she planned on going on this extended solo camping trip in the Sierra National Forest, and that she would be in touch with them in the coming weeks when she was back out. To Sandra, this trip was going to bring her lots of happiness and fulfillment, and it was going to allow her to continue to adhere to quarantine guidelines because she'd be all alone. Shortly after speaking with her family on the 26th, Sandra loaded up all of her camping equipment into her silver Saab sedan, and then she would drive from her place south and then east a little over an hour until she was deep inside of the Sierra National Forest. At some point, she would leave the main road and she would hop onto a bumpy dirt road that kind of wound through the forest, and that road would bring her out to an area called the Johnson Meadows. The Johnson Meadows are absolutely gorgeous. It looks straight out of a postcard. It's basically a stretch of beautiful green meadows, and then around the perimeter of those meadows are the thick trees of the Sierra National Forest, and then beyond those trees are the snow-capped Sierra Mountains. But despite its beauty, the Johnson Meadows are actually fairly dangerous. It's a very isolated part of the Sierra National Forest, and there are lots of cougars and bears and other natural hazards in the area, so it's not really a place you go unless you're prepared to be there. And Sandra was certainly that, both in terms of her survival experience and the gear she brought with her. So when Sandra drove her car right up to the edge of the Johnson Meadows, she parked her car off to the side of the road so as not to block the road, and then she got out, she collected her things from the trunk, and then she threw it over her shoulder and began hiking into the middle of the Johnson Meadows to look for a place to set up her campsite. 6 days later, on July 2nd, some hikers came out of the tree line into Johnson Meadows and began walking across the center of it. And as they're walking along, they notice up ahead what looks like a tent and a campsite. They don't see anybody near it, but they clearly see someone is camping in the middle of Johnson Meadows. And so this is totally not unusual. Lots of people go hiking and camping in this area. And so these hikers just began kind of creating a wide berth around this person's campsite because they didn't want to cut right through the middle of it as they went across the meadow. But as they're making this kind of wide berth around this campsite, they looked over at it, and as they passed by it, they noticed that the campsite was definitely abandoned, and it looked totally destroyed, like a tornado had crossed right across it. And so when they were parallel with this campsite, the hikers decided to actually go over and look at it and see what was going on. So they walked over to this campsite, and they're looking around, and they see there's a backpack that's clearly been dumped out, and all of its contents are strewn around all over the ground. There's unopened cans of food, there's papers and documents, the tent is in ruins. I mean, the place is just a total mess. And so the hikers didn't really know what to make of this. They couldn't tell if a person had kind of intentionally ransacked this site, or if maybe an animal had come through. But as a precaution, they marked down on their map where this destroyed campsite was, and then they hiked out of the forest, and when they were back in cell phone range, they called the Madera County Sheriff's Office and they reported the site. And so later that day, some Madera County sheriffs made their way out to Johnson Meadows, and sure enough, the campsite is still there, it's still in ruins, and it's still abandoned. And so they would search the campsite and they would find some ID cards, and the name on those ID cards was Sandra Hughes. The sheriffs would leave the forest and get in touch with Sandra's family to find out if they knew why Sandra had left her campsite the way she had. But when Sandra's family heard about the state of Sandra's campsite, they had an immediate and definitive reaction to it. They told the sheriffs that Sandra was incredibly environmentally conscious and was very cleanly, and so she would never, ever leave her campsite looking that way on purpose. Something else had to have happened. The family would also tell the sheriffs that they had not spoken with Sandra since the 26th when she started her trip, and so they had no idea where she could be now. And so naturally, the family was concerned, the sheriffs were concerned, and so that day they filed an official missing person report. Over the next 2 days, a massive search was launched in Johnson Meadows and the surrounding area to look for Sandra. And so hundreds of people were out on foot, they had sniffer dogs out, there were helicopters in the air, and during the search, the Madera County Sheriff's Office was interviewing anybody who was out there, hikers, campers, and asking them if they had had any contact with Sandra, because Sandra was actually quite distinctive looking. Before she left for this trip, she had dyed her hair blue. But unfortunately, no one had seen Sandra, and despite this massive search effort over these first 2 days, nothing new was discovered that could lead authorities to where she had gone. But then on July 4th, so 2 days into her disappearance, Sandra Hughes was spotted. Some hikers were cutting through the Johnson Meadows area, and they saw this woman who was just standing off to the side of the meadow. She was by herself, she had no gear with her, she was barefoot, she had a black shirt on, she had blue jeans on, she had a bruise on her face, and she was just kind of standing there as if she was waiting for something. And as these hikers walked past her, they definitely noticed her, but she didn't wave them down, she didn't act distressed, she didn't look like she needed any help. They just kind of saw this person minding their own business, and they walked right on past her. It wasn't until those hikers got to the parking lot that they saw all these missing person flyers out for Sandra Hughes, and they would see the picture of Sandra, and they would see her distinctive blue hair, that they would say, oh my goodness, the barefoot woman we just saw standing in the forest is Sandra Hughes. And so the hikers called the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office got really jazzed up. They headed out to where they had claimed to have seen her, but there was no sign of her, and there was nothing left behind that would indicate where she might have gone. The following day, on July 5th, Sandra's vehicle was located, but Sandra was not with it. It was found 5 miles north of where her destroyed campsite was in Johnson Meadows, and the vehicle was actually at the bottom of a ravine, and this ravine was right next to a winding forest road. And so after looking at the damage on the front of the car, authorities believed Sandra was driving the car on that road and then hit a tree, and then she rolled off the embankment down to the bottom of the ravine. There was no blood inside the vehicle, so it wasn't immediately clear if this accident had actually done any physical harm to Sandra. But the most significant thing about the discovery of this vehicle was the state of Sandra's personal effects that had been in the vehicle. Clearly, after the vehicle had come to a stop at the bottom of the ravine, someone had pulled out all of the things inside of the car, all of Sandra's personal things, and kind of thrown them carelessly all over the forest floor, as if they were kind of rummaging through her car looking for something, throwing things as they went. And the Madera County sheriffs couldn't help but think that this was eerily similar to how her campsite looked in Johnson Meadows, where all of her personal effects had just kind of been chucked all over the place. At this point, authorities did not believe Sandra was actively trying to evade them. Instead, they thought, maybe Sandra got hurt, maybe back at the campsite or even during this car accident, and the injury has impaired her cognitive abilities, and so now, maybe she's lost in the woods and doesn't know what's going on. There was some discussion about foul play maybe being involved, but that was largely discounted. And so a decision was made to just leave her vehicle where it was at the bottom of the ravine, thinking, maybe Sandra is going to come back to this vehicle, and maybe that's why all these things have been strewn around, because she's coming back and looking for something. And so authorities left a note in the window of her vehicle that said, hey, Sandra, we're looking for you. Please call this number if you see this. And then at the bottom of this note, it said, your family really misses you. The search for Sandra would continue over the next several days with a new focus around the area where the car had been found, but nothing new was discovered. Then, on the evening of July 12th, so 1 week after the vehicle was discovered, a team of searchers had made their way 2.5 miles north of the vehicle, and they were actually inside of Yosemite National Park. They were barely inside, and they were right up along this lake called the Spotted Lake. Now, this is an area that's very difficult to get to. There are no main roads that get there. There are no main trails that get there. And so the searchers, they're up in this very rugged part of Yosemite. And as they're walking along with their flashlights out, they see a sleeping bag, and it's laying out right in the middle of the ground, in the middle of nowhere. And it looks like it's been used recently. And it would turn out that sleeping bag was Sandra's. But again, when they brought all the searchers out to that area and they searched all around the Spotted Lake and all over this area, there was no sign of Sandra. At this point, authorities were totally baffled. On a map, Johnson Meadows, where her first campsite was, then her vehicle, and then this sleeping bag were all more or less in a straight line going south to north. It was almost like Sandra, from the day she went missing, had just begun slowly working her way to the north, but she was doing it without any equipment and most likely barefoot in an area that was steep and rugged and dangerous and full of cougars and bears. And so authorities knew if they didn't find her soon, even if she was doing this on purpose, she was likely going to succumb to the elements. The search for Sandra would continue for another week after the discovery of her sleeping bag, but by that time, by July 20th, there hadn't been any new developments. No one had seen Sandra, there were no new leads, and so unfortunately, the authorities had to scale back their search. About 3 weeks later, on August 9th, 2 hunters were driving down this very desolate forest road, located several miles to the east of where Sandra's car had been found. And as they're driving along, they turn this corner, and as soon as they do, they look up ahead and they see there's this woman. Now, she's not standing on the road or even right next to the road. She's kind of tucked up a ways on this hillside in the trees, and she's leaning up against a tree. And so the hunters are looking at her, and they're seeing that she's got no equipment with her. There's no backpack, there's nothing, no tent, and there's no other people anywhere. I mean, they're in a very isolated part of this forest, and it's odd to see people here to begin with, let alone this woman who's just kind of casually standing up against a tree. And so the hunters, they're like, okay, let's drive up and see if she needs something. And so they pull up right up alongside her. She's still, 10, 15 feet away from them, tucked up in the trees. And so they roll their windows down and they're looking up at her, trying to kind of flag her and get her attention. But the woman is not paying attention to them at all. She just continues to prop herself up against this tree and just kind of stares off into the distance. And so the hunters, they're looking up at her thinking, what's going on with this woman? And they kind of called out to her. They tried to wave her down, but there was nothing. There was no interactions with them. And so ultimately the hunters thought, okay, well, we don't know what this woman's doing, but it seems like she's here on purpose and she doesn't seem like she's in distress. She doesn't look hurt. And so they just decided to carry on. And so they drove off, and then later that day, they would see one of the missing person flyers for Sandra Hughes, and they saw the blue hair in the picture, and they were like, oh my goodness, the woman we saw standing up against the tree in the middle of the forest was that woman, Sandra Hughes. The hunters would contact the Madera County Sheriff's Office and report this sighting, and they would describe Sandra as looking slightly thinner than the picture of her on her missing person flyer, and they would also say she was wearing overalls and a floral t-shirt, which was interesting to sheriffs because the last time Sandra was sighted, which was on July 4th, when those hikers had seen her barefoot with a bruise on her face near Johnson Meadows, she had been wearing a black shirt and blue jeans. And so clearly she had changed her outfit, but that didn't really make any sense because she had left all of her things at the campsite and her car, and so the whole situation was just totally weird to the sheriffs. But regardless, they headed out to that road where the hunters had seen Sandra, but like always, Sandra was not there, and there was no sign she had ever been there. After this, Sandra's case went cold, and so authorities and her family began to brace for the reality that they likely would never see her again. But there was one more terrifying twist coming. A year later, on Wednesday, July 21st, 2021, Jake Gorba, his wife Victoria, and their 3 young children were driving in Jake's off-roading vehicle up the steep forest road in the middle of Sierra National Forest on their way to the top of Shut-Eye Peak. Shut-Eye Peak is a mountain in the Sierra National Forest with stunning panoramic views from the top, and it's located about 5 miles to the south of Johnson Meadows, where Sandra's first campsite was discovered. So Jake and his family, they're driving their way up this long, bumpy, winding forest road, making their way towards the top of Shut-Eye Peak, and when they get about halfway, the kids in the back start complaining that they're hungry. And so Jake and Victoria, they decide, you know what, let's just pull over at the next natural stopping point and we'll have a quick lunch and then we'll continue on the rest of the way. And as luck would have it, the road they were on would actually level off and lead them to this kind of short, flat section of the mountain. And in this flat section was this beautiful little meadow that butted up against some trees. And so Jake and his wife thought this is a great place to stop and have a little picnic. And so he pulled his truck over on the side of the road, he parked it, he turned the engine off, and then as Jake and his wife are kind of gathering up their things before they get out of the vehicle to go prepare this picnic lunch, they hear their 3-year-old son, named Caden, who's in the back seat right near a window, start talking. And so Jake and Victoria instinctively turned around to see who Caden was talking to, and they saw Caden was not talking to himself, he was not talking to his siblings, he was turned and looking out his open window, looking across this small meadow into the forest, engaged in some sort of intense conversation with somebody outside. And so Jake and Victoria, they see their son, and they look out the window in the direction he's looking and talking, and they don't see anyone. And so Victoria, she looks at her son and goes, "Caden, who are you talking to?" And what he would say to her would send goosebumps all over her body. And in fact, what would happen over the next several minutes from that point onward was so unsettling that Jake and Victoria decided, you know what? We're not going to the top of Shut-Eye Peak. We're turning around and we're leaving. And so they would speed out of the forest and they would get back home. And that night, Victoria would make a Facebook post about what her son said and this terrifying ordeal they experienced on Shut-Eye Peak, and she would post it. And that night, the Madera County Sheriff's Office would reach out to Victoria via a Facebook message, and they would tell her, "Hey, we saw your post. Can we please speak to you and your son?" And so the next day, the sheriffs met up with the Gorba family, and after speaking with Caden and hearing what he had to say, they would leave that exchange just as unsettled as Caden's parents. The day before, when Victoria turned around and looked at Caden and said, "Who are you talking to?" Caden would turn away from the window and look at his mom, and he would say, "There's a woman out there and she needs our help," and he starts pointing out the window. And so again, Jake and Victoria, they look from their son back out the window into the tree line, which is where Caden is pointing, and they don't see anyone. And so they turn back to Caden and they say, "Honey, we don't see anyone out there." And Caden, at this point, he becomes emphatic and he says, "Mom, you gotta trust me. She's right there. She needs our help. She's lying face down, her legs are straight up, and she's dead." And so at this point, Victoria and Jake are looking at their son thinking, what's going on here? Jake promptly hops out of the car and just starts running into the woods to see what's going on. Is there a person out here? But he's out there looking around and there's no one. And while he's out there, his son is pointing in the direction of where he is, claiming there's this woman right near him. And so Jake's looking around thinking, there's no one out here. I have no idea what my son's on about. And so he's spooked. He runs back to the car. And when he gets inside, Caden is still looking out the window. He's pointing and he's talking to this dead woman that needs their help. And so Jake and Victoria, they were horrified. They turned around, they left. And then that night, when Victoria made that Facebook post, she included in the post what this woman apparently looked like based on what Caden said. And what Caden said was she had a black t-shirt on, blue jeans on, and blue hair. And so when the Madera County Sheriff's Office saw this post that described seeing a person in a black shirt, blue jeans, and blue hair, they knew that description matched Sandra Hughes. And so when the sheriffs met up with the Gorba family, they brought with them a lineup of several women. And they went right up to Caden, and without giving him any extra information, they just showed him all these pictures of all these women. And they said, Caden, can you identify in any of these pictures the woman you saw in the woods? And Caden looks at these pictures, and he picks out 3 pictures. All 3 are Sandra Hughes. The sheriffs, along with Caden and his father, they would return to that section of Shut-Eye Peak to search the tree line near the meadow to see if there was any sign of Sandra or any indication that she had been there, but like always, there was nothing. As of today, we still have no idea where Sandra is or what happened to her, and nobody has any idea what to make of the very strange sightings of her that occurred after she went missing. It's all just one big mystery. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please sign the 5-star review button up for your very casual, very friendly, slow machine pitch baseball league. But when it's their turn at bat, switch the machine out for a grenade launcher. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast on Amazon Music, because starting November 1st of this year, 2022, our podcast is only going to be available on Amazon Music. However, from now until November 1st, you can still get the podcast on all platforms. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. We now have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen Foundation that makes it as easy as possible for you to join me, my family, and my team in supporting those whose lives have been most impacted by violent and heinous crimes. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. But the real reward is helping to create a new ending to the story for victims of violent crime. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. In the late 1800s, a very strange hotel was constructed in Chicago, Illinois. From the outside, it looked perfectly normal, but the inside of the hotel was anything but. Hallways were a maze of twists and turns, and there were trapdoors, sliding walls, and secret stairwells everywhere. But the shock factor of this hotel was part of its allure. Walking around and getting lost could actually be kind of thrilling. But what guests didn't know was that every time they got lost in that hotel, they might never find their way out again. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to house sit for the 5-star review button, and when you're there, cut all the drawstrings on their sweatpants. Also, please subscribe to the MrBallen podcast wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. It was the summer of 1888, and the residents of Englewood, Chicago had something new and exciting to talk about. The young, prosperous, and handsome owner of the neighborhood's local pharmacy, who had only arrived in Illinois 3 years earlier, had just bought the big empty lot on the corner of 63rd and Wallace Street. And since then, the owner, 28-year-old Dr. Henry Holmes, had let his many customers know that he was planning to build a grand hotel on that site, the likes of which this village on the south side of the largest Midwestern city in America had never seen before. But some Englewood residents had their doubts. On their way to or from work that July and August, groups of businessmen in black top hats and starched white collars paused at the huge vacant lot, tut-tutting over the cost of building on such marshy land, while sweat-stained day laborers shook their heads over the challenges of sinking a basement and foundation into that soft and shifting ground. But as Dr. Holmes himself looked at that ugly, barren property just across the street from his neat and profitable drugstore, all he felt was thrilled. It was the Gilded Age in America when captains of industry in Chicago lived in mansions so enormous that they looked like castles, showy and glittering gems spread out along South Prairie Avenue and North Lakeshore Drive. And now, after 3 years of hard work and saving money, Dr. Holmes was sure that building and owning this hotel would be his first big step towards joining the exalted ranks of the city's self-made millionaires. The design for the building had come to Dr. Holmes months earlier, all at once, a complete picture right from the start of how the hotel would look both on the outside and on the inside. It would be 3 stories high, the first floor would house retail shops, he would sell his current drugstore and open a new one inside of his hotel on the first floor, along with a jewelry store, a restaurant, a barbershop, and a business that would sell the huge glass window panes that were in such high demand for the skyscrapers that were going up all over the heart of Chicago. The second and third floors of what Dr. Holmes thought of as his castle would each contain 35 rooms, with the third floor offering suites of rooms for long-term residents. His own office would be located on the second floor in a corner overlooking the street. His quarters would also include rooms in the basement that he would use for his medical research. From the outside, the hotel would look impressive but ordinary. It was the interior of the hotel that Holmes intended to design in ways that he hoped would startle and delight the people who came to stay. It didn't take long for Dr. Holmes to commit this vision to paper, and by summer of the following year, 1889, he had the hotel blueprints and design finished, and enough money to start hiring construction workers. And just a few months later, on a hot day in July, Dr. Holmes watched with shining eyes from the doorway of his pharmacy as workers sank the first shovel into the wet earth across the street. His hotel project had officially begun. But despite his excitement, it would turn out that both the businessmen who had tut-tutted and shaken their heads over the cost of the project and the day laborers who had shaken their heads over the difficulty of building in marshy ground were right. The construction of Dr. Holmes's hotel would end up dragging for nearly 2 years until 1891 when they actually opened the hotel, but even then it wasn't done. They still had a year or 2 before it was actually finished. But as delayed as the project was, it actually would have taken even longer if Dr. Holmes had not been lucky enough to hire the man who would become not only his trusted construction foreman, but also his close personal friend. That man was Benjamin Pitezel. Benjamin Pitezel had arrived in Chicago from Indiana around the time Dr. Holmes's hotel was starting to be built. Benjamin was a tall, strong, 33-year-old carpenter who made up for his tendency to drink too much by his absolute devotion to his wife Carrie and their 5 children, who ranged in age from a few months old to 14 years old. Benjamin had come to Chicago determined to take any job he could that would provide for his growing family. And as he helped his wife and children off the train into Chicago's Grand Depot, he took special care with his 9-year-old daughter Nellie, who had been born with a clubfoot, a birth defect that twisted her foot out of shape and made it difficult for her to walk. Like so many people arriving in Chicago for the first time, the Pitezel family could hardly believe the noise, crowds, and the skyscrapers in the center of the city that towered above the streets like the walls of a canyon. Another thing they couldn't believe was the smell from the huge stockyards in South Chicago. It wasn't just the smell of livestock, it was the stink from the slaughterhouses located along the South Side Railroad that made Chicago the meatpacking capital of the United States and the hog butcher for the world. After getting off the train, the older Pitezel children immediately covered their noses, but Benjamin told them that the smell wouldn't be so bad once they hopped aboard the next train that would take them out to the village of Englewood, where he'd heard that a hotel was going up, and the owner always seemed to need more workers, so maybe there was a job for him. It wasn't hard for Benjamin to go to the construction site and locate Dr. Holmes, who was now spending most of his time feeling frustrated by what he saw as the shoddy work done by many of the men he had hired. But few, if any, of the workers that Dr. Holmes had let go and withheld wages from afterwards ever stuck around to complain about it. In fact, a lot of these fired workers actually felt relieved as soon as they were let go, because there was something truly unsettling about the hotel's very unorthodox design. The outside was like any other hotel at the time, but the inside was unlike anything they had ever been asked to build before. The blueprints called for secret staircases, false walls and ceilings, trapdoors, and passageways that dead-ended into doors that when you opened them, you were just looking at a wall, not into a room. The blueprints also showed rooms that had no doors or windows and were only accessible via sliding walls or secret passageways. And other rooms on the blueprints appeared normal, but they were actually padded around the outside with a layer of asbestos that made them soundproof. Inside Dr. Holmes's personal office space, workers were ordered to construct a large walk-in vault with a special room built around the outside of it to ensure that the vault could never be removed from the hotel unless the room itself was dismantled first. After one architect was declared incompetent by Dr. Holmes, he proceeded to walk off the site, wondering whether he'd been asked to build a hotel or a carnival-style funhouse. But anytime questions were raised about Dr. Holmes's design, the doctor would just say, "I gave you the blueprints, please just build my hotel." So on the afternoon that Benjamin Pitezel made his way over to the hotel construction site and found Dr. Holmes, he saw that the doctor was in the middle of an argument with the man that he had hired to build a glass-bending furnace in the basement that would produce the windows he hoped to sell in his retail store on the first level. The doctor was telling the furnace maker that the furnace he had just installed was not reaching high enough temperatures, a charge that the tradesman did not believe was true. After the furnace maker angrily stalked away, Dr. Holmes turned to Benjamin, who had put on his best suit and brushed off his worn top hat in preparation for what he hoped would turn into a job interview, and Dr. Holmes immediately noted the effort that Benjamin had clearly made in his appearance, and he instantly took a liking to the tall carpenter with the well-defined chin. To Dr. Holmes, Benjamin immediately seemed like the kind of person he needed to help guide this gargantuan construction project to the finish line. Someone who really knew carpentry and who could handle themselves in what the doctor had come to feel was an increasingly hostile worksite. By the end of their initial 15-minute conversation, Dr. Holmes had indeed offered Benjamin a job, and he recommended temporary lodgings in Englewood for Benjamin and his family. Within just a few weeks, Benjamin had stepped into a supervisory role at the construction site, and sure enough, under his direction, both the quality and pace of work picked up dramatically. And while this was certainly very exciting for Dr. Holmes, it was nothing compared to the excitement he felt in early 1890 when he realized his investment into this hotel was about to pay off big time. In early 1890, Chicago got the news that they had just been named as the location for the 1893 World's Fair, beating out both New York City and St. Louis, Missouri. Chicago politicians and the team of architects who would design the buildings and exhibits for the extravaganza were already estimating that the massive event would attract at least 25 million visitors to the so-called Windy City, a nickname that Chicago had just earned, not for the cold breeze that blew off of nearby Lake Michigan, but because of all the windy talk by Chicago politicians who had assured the World Fair Selection Committee that their upstart city in the Midwest could throw a party like no one on Earth had ever seen before. So, even as Dr. Holmes tallied up the ever-rising costs of building this hotel, he knew as soon as that fair came to town, he was virtually guaranteed to become a very rich man. Because by that time, his hotel would be complete and all those fair attendees would come pouring through his doors looking to rent rooms. In late 1890, about 10 months or so after the announcement of the location of the World's Fair, Ned and Julia Connor were hired by Dr. Holmes to work on the first floor of his nearly completed hotel. Ned was hired to manage the newly opened little jewelry store, and Ned's wife, Julia, had been hired to keep the books in the new drugstore. And if that wasn't good news enough for the couple, the doctor had also offered them, along with their 8-year-old daughter Pearl, free room and board on the second floor of the hotel until the parents earned enough money to buy or rent a place of their own. While Ned was a fairly average man who admired the ambitions of other men more than pursuing any big dreams himself, his wife Julia was a 6-foot-tall beauty who was often annoyed by her husband's timidity. Back in Iowa, their lives had been quiet and predictable. Here in Chicago, Julia loved the flow of people into and out of the stores, and she also began to enjoy the attention of the men who were struck by her good looks and small-town naivete. One man in particular, a regular at the hotel who always wore a black bowler hat and who had rooms on the second floor, began spending quite a lot of time in the drugstore, listening very attentively to anything Julia said, and standing very close to her when they talked. Ned was totally oblivious, but his customers were not. They could tell that there was obviously something going on between Ned's wife, Julia, and the man in the bowler hat. A visit from Ned's sister, Gertrude, warmed the increasingly chilly atmosphere that had settled over the room where Ned and Pearl and Julia lived. But not long into what was supposed to be an extended stay, Gertrude suddenly cut her visit short. She didn't give much of an explanation other than to say that she found the hotel very gloomy and strange, and once or twice in the evening she had lost her way in the maze of hallways, and she was certain someone was following her. With Gertrude gone, tensions in the Connor marriage came to a boiling point. Ned didn't know what was wrong with his wife, but it was clear she wanted nothing more to do with him. In the summer of 1891, when he finally threatened to leave her if things did not improve, her answer was immediate and final. Our separation can't happen soon enough. A few months after that, in November of 1891, Julia told the man in the bowler hat, who had gone from just paying close attention to her to sharing her bed, that she was pregnant. The man instantly agreed to marry her, but he had one very specific condition for marriage. Julia agreed to his terms, and after that, they set a date of Christmas Eve to actually perform this very specific thing that the man in the bowler hat required in order to marry her. On Christmas Eve, December 24th, Julia tucked her 8-year-old daughter Pearl into bed. Pearl had missed her father terribly of late, but she was very excited about the presents that might be waiting for her tomorrow under the tree. After Pearl had fallen asleep, Julia left the room and quietly made her way down the dim hotel hallway to a suite of rooms where some of her friends lived. It was Mr. and Mrs. Crow, who were long-term hotel guests. The couple would be leaving the next morning to spend Christmas with their relatives, but Mrs. Crow had invited Julia to decorate a tree in the Crow's apartment for Pearl to enjoy the next day. While they hung ornaments, Julia chatted excitedly about Christmas and about her plans to go to Davenport, Iowa soon with Pearl for the wedding of Julia's older sister. The next morning, Mrs. Crow and her husband got up early and waited by the door patiently for Julia and Pearl to arrive at their apartment. Their plan was to let them in and chat with them for a few minutes and wish them a Merry Christmas before they left for their own Christmas celebration. But Julia and Pearl never arrived, and when Mrs. Crow went down the hallway to knock on Julia's door, there was no answer. Around the same time, while Dr. Holmes was on Christmas vacation himself, he started to receive a number of letters from parents and relatives of women who had vanished. In all of these letters, these heartbroken parents, sisters, and brothers would say that their missing loved one had mentioned being in Englewood, Chicago before they went missing, and so could Dr. Holmes check to see if maybe they were at his hotel or if they had been there recently. Dr. Holmes was alarmed and kind of overwhelmed by these letters, and so he decided to just put them in his desk until he got back to work after the holiday. And when the holiday was over and he did go back to work at the hotel, before he could even begin to dive into these letters, Mrs. Crow approached him and asked him if he knew where his employee, Julia Connor, and her daughter Pearl were, as they still had not been seen or heard from since Christmas Eve. When Dr. Holmes asked his janitor to check on Julia's room, the room looked as though Julia and Pearl had simply gotten up and walked out the door, intending to return at any moment, but obviously they hadn't. As strange as this was, Dr. Holmes knew Julia's marriage had collapsed and that she was trying to plan a trip back to Iowa with her daughter to see family, and so he told Mrs. Crow that Julia and Pearl must have just decided to go to Iowa early. Mrs. Crow was not entirely sold because the whole thing seemed very strange, but she accepted the answer and walked away. After that, Dr. Holmes would spend some time looking into those letters about the other missing women, and he would send some follow-up responses to the family members and friends who had written him, mostly just saying that yes, some of these women had been at his hotel, but he really didn't know what happened to them after they left. Eventually, after looking at so many letters, Dr. Holmes decided that, these missing people were really not his responsibility, and so he kind of just stopped writing back. A few months later, in the spring of 1892, a few weeks before the scheduled start of construction of the Chicago World's Fair, Dr. Holmes hired another bookkeeper to replace Julia, who was still gone. The replacement bookkeeper was a 24-year-old friendly young woman named Emmeline Segrand. She was from Indiana, and she had the lightest color blonde hair Dr. Holmes had ever seen. She was excited at the prospect of working right next to the World's Fair, and she'd brought her life savings with her, $800, which today would be worth more than $26,000. Emmeline rented rooms in a boarding house near the hotel, and it wasn't long after starting her job at the hotel before Emmeline, too, had bumped into the handsome fellow who had earlier won the heart of Julia Connor, the man in the bowler hat. Soon, Emmeline and this man were spending as much time together as they could. Emmeline's handsome suitor taught her how to ride one of the newly designed bicycles that were all the rage, and when Emmeline wasn't working at the hotel, she and the man in the bowler hat, who had quickly become her lover, took long rides along the pathways just outside of Jackson Park, where the fair was slowly being set up. Like hundreds of other residents of neighborhoods near Jackson Park, Emmeline and the man in the bowler hat watched arm in arm as the so-called White City of the Chicago's World Fair began to take shape in front of them. The White City was this huge stretch of land at the center of Jackson Park, where big white stucco buildings were being built to house the fair's thousands of shows and exhibits. That summer, Emmeline's lover had asked her to marry him, and Emmeline hardly waited for him to finish his proposal before she said yes. But by the fall of that year, something had changed inside of Emmeline. She began talking to one of her good friends, her name was Mrs. Lawrence, about her desire to take a trip back to her family in Indiana, and hinting that it likely would be a long visit, that she really needed a break from Englewood. Then, sometime during the first week of December of that year, Emmeline visited Mrs. Lawrence, who lived on the second floor of Dr. Holmes's hotel. But not long after arriving, Emmeline told Mrs. Lawrence that she just hated being in that hotel. It was gloomy and dark and oppressive, and she just hated it. During this visit, Emmeline would also tell Mrs. Lawrence that she was worried about her life savings. She had handed it over to her fiancé, the man in the bowler hat, for safekeeping, as he had suggested. But every time she asked him to return it, he would just kind of blow her off. And as much as it pained her to say this out loud, she could tell his interest in her was also just waning. Before she left, Emmeline would give Mrs. Lawrence a Christmas gift that she had bought for her. Mrs. Lawrence would smile and thank her, and she would tell Emmeline to be sure to come back closer to Christmas because she had a gift for her as well. But shortly after that visit, Emmeline, just like Julia Connor and her daughter Pearl, seemed to have vanished. When Mrs. Lawrence noticed Emmeline's absence, she went to Dr. Holmes's office to see if he knew where she went. And Dr. Holmes, with a slight look of frustration on his face, said that Emmeline had come to him and said she was leaving to get married and go on a honeymoon to Europe, and so he didn't know if she was coming back or not. Which meant, once again, Dr. Holmes was without a bookkeeper and would need to hire yet another one. 3 months later, in March of 1893, Dr. Holmes received yet another inquiry about a missing woman. But this time, it was about a woman he recognized. The sender was Emmeline Segran's father, asking if Dr. Holmes had information that might help the Segrans find their daughter. Dr. Holmes was surprised and wrote back the same thing he had told Mrs. Lawrence, that Emmeline had left the hotel in December because of her marriage plans. Dr. Holmes suggested that the Segrand family contact her other employers and see if maybe they know something, and if they did learn anything about Emmeline's whereabouts, to please contact him and let him know. Emmeline's disappearance put Julia's and Pearl's disappearance in a whole new light for Dr. Holmes. It also made Dr. Holmes look differently at all those letters he had gotten from the family and friends of other missing women in the area. But Dr. Holmes was a busy man, and so not long after writing back to Emmeline's father, he was back focusing on expanding his business empire. An empire that included not only his hotel business, but also his mail order company that sold various ointments and elixirs he developed, including one he claimed cured alcoholism. A few months after Emmeline's father had sent that letter to Dr. Holmes, the World's Fair finally opened its doors. Thousands of people an hour strolled through the gleaming white exhibit halls inside of White City, where visitors from all over the world experienced for the first time things like elevators, moving pictures, voice recordings, Wrigley's chewing gum, Cracker Jack popcorn, and the zipper, which would revolutionize women's fashion. It was the first time people would taste brownies and the sausages that would later become the Chicago-style hot dog. 38,000 people a day rode on the world's first Ferris wheel, which was more than 25 stories tall and equipped with compartments that looked like rail cars and that held up to 60 people each. There was one man in particular who seemed to attend the fair every night, and that was the man in the bowler hat. He was handsome and refined looking, and he smiled at all the ladies, buying them cold dishes of ice cream while they watched the incredibly popular Wild West show put on by the famous frontiersman Wild Bill Cody. This same man who had seduced Julia Connor and Emmeline Segran before they went missing now graciously opened a path in the crowds for the older wealthy women whose families back home didn't expect to see them for days, and who would never know until it was too late that this wealthy mother or grandmother or relative was never going to come home at all. Smiling and attentive, the man in the bowler hat drifted in and out of the pavilions that housed exotic encampments of people from other countries and walked along the lagoons dotted with sailboats powered by brand new electric motors. Some nights, the man in the bowler hat left the fairgrounds alone. But other nights, as he headed toward Dr. Holmes's World Fair Hotel, he would be holding the arm of a woman, leaning over her protectively as the two of them made their way toward the gloomy castle on 63rd and Wallace. By the time the fair ended on October 30th, 1893, Chicago had in fact shown the world that the Windy City could throw the party to end all parties. The fair wound up breaking all sorts of attendance records, with a staggering 27 million people passing through their gates into the White City, which now stood empty and abandoned inside of Jackson Park. But as successful as the fair had been, it also had a dark side. During the fair, 12 firefighters had died trying to put out a blaze that burned down the Hall of Electricity. The mayor of Chicago, who was scheduled to be a part of the fair's closing ceremonies, was assassinated in his home just 2 days prior by a disgruntled and mentally ill voter. And police and private detective agencies were getting flooded with more and more reports of missing men and women, people who had left homes far away to see the wonders of the world at this fair, and then were never seen again. But with a homicide rate of 4 murders a day in Chicago at the time, police were so overwhelmed by violent crimes that only a very small handful of these missing persons reports got any attention. As for Dr. Holmes, the fair had indeed made him a rich man, but it was bittersweet. Julia and her daughter Pearl were still missing, as was Emmeline, and many of the other missing people in the city had stayed at his hotel before they vanished. This, of course, caused Dr. Holmes a considerable amount of distress, but fortunately, during the fair, Dr. Holmes had met someone. And now, when he was with her, whatever stress he had just seemed to melt away. Her name was Georgiana Yoke. She was 23, small, blonde, and had large blue eyes and a sharp mind. Together, they had wandered the fairgrounds, riding the Ferris wheel and quickly falling in love. By the time the fair ended, they had gotten married. And then, not long after that, with his wife's encouragement, Dr. Holmes decided that as much as he wanted to help all of these families and people who kept writing to him about their missing loved ones, he simply couldn't. He didn't have any answers to give them. And so, from then on, he simply began tucking the new letters he would receive every week into his desk drawer, and then he just did his best to keep going forward in his own life, assuming that the police would handle all of these missing people. But, as Dr. Holmes would eventually learn, no matter what he did or where he went, he would forever be tied to those missing people, because before those people vanished, they encountered the monster that roamed the halls of his hotel, the man in the bowler hat. After the World's Fair ended, Dr. Holmes decided he needed to pursue a new business opportunity, and the idea he thought of was one that he had come up with years earlier when he was a medical student at Michigan University. But at the time, for whatever reason, he had just not acted on this idea. The idea was a little complicated, but the payoff could be huge. However, in order to make it work, the doctor needed a very trustworthy partner. So, late in the summer of 1894, roughly 8 months after the World's Fair had ended, Dr. Holmes looked up his good old trusty hotel construction foreman and close friend, Benjamin Pitezel, who was now living in St. Louis with his wife and children. Benjamin's drinking had only gotten worse over the years, and after finishing up the hotel project, he had struggled to make ends meet financially. So, after hearing Dr. Holmes's pitch about this new business idea, even though it required Ben to move away from his wife and kids temporarily to Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, something he really didn't want to do, and even though the plan seemed very risky, Ben ultimately agreed to do it. As for Benjamin's wife, Carrie, she was not thrilled at the idea of her husband being gone for an extended period of time, but like her husband, she trusted Dr. Holmes's business instincts. And just the year before, Dr. Holmes had actually paid out of pocket for Ben to get a life insurance policy worth $10,000, which is approximately $350,000 by today's standards. And as morbid as it was, the thought of that life insurance policy eased the anxiety Carrie felt about her husband temporarily relocating. Because if something happened to him, their family would be okay, at least financially. So eventually, Carrie would give the plan her blessing. On the face of it, their plan was simple. Ben would rent office space in Philadelphia and get set up as a patent investor, someone who evaluates the potential success of newly patented inventions and invests money in the ones that look like they have good earning potential. With his knack for gadgets and machinery, all Ben really had to do was identify a couple of good money-making prospects. And then from there, Dr. Holmes would handle the rest. By August of 1894, Benjamin had arrived in Philadelphia and had found a small office with an upstairs set of bedrooms. In the downstairs office window, anyone who was walking by could see a new, neatly lettered sign that read "Patents Bought and Sold." Ben didn't have to wait very long before he had his first customer. It was a young carpenter whose invention for improving the production and quality of handsaws was promising enough that Ben scheduled a second meeting with him for the following week. But when the young man came back the following week to the patent office on Tuesday, September 4th, Benjamin was nowhere to be found. After waiting nearly an hour downstairs, the young man began calling out for Benjamin, but there was no answer. So the young man decided to go investigate. He stood up from the chair he was in and walked around the desk toward the back door of the office that led to a set of creaky stairs. He took those stairs up to the second floor, and as he turned down the short upstairs hallway toward a partially opened door, the young man suddenly stopped. There was this horrible smell in the air. He clapped his hand over his mouth and his nose, and with a terrible sense of dread, he walked forward and then pushed that partially open door all the way open. A minute later, gagging at what he had just seen, the young man was back out on the street. He ran to a nearby drugstore and he told the store owner that something terrible had just happened inside of the new patent investment office a few doors down. A few minutes later, the young man and that shop owner were looking down at the bloated and putrefying corpse of Benjamin Peitzel. Ben was lying on his back on the floor, baking in the hot sunlight that was beating into the room through the glass of the closed window nearby. His hair and part of his face had been badly burned. His tongue was swollen and stuck out of his mouth. Also, draining out of his mouth was a stream of strange-looking red fluid. Just from the looks of it, it seemed fairly obvious that Benjamin had been dead at least for a couple of days. On the floor near Benjamin's body, there was a broken smoking pipe, a match, and a broken glass jar that had contained benzene, a highly flammable liquid that Ben had apparently been mixing with other acids to make a washing powder. An initial investigation by the police determined that Ben had died an accidental death. He must have just been standing too close to the jar of benzene when he struck a match to light his pipe, and then the liquid must have exploded and killed him, burning his face and hair in the process. But, based on an examination of Benjamin's body later that afternoon, a very different picture started to emerge about what really happened to Benjamin. And it would turn out what happened to Benjamin had everything to do with the monster inside of Dr. Holmes's hotel, the man in the bowler hat. Based on a series of discoveries that were made following Benjamin's death, this is a reconstruction of what really happened to him and who this monster really was. 2 days before the young man discovered Benjamin's dead body, Benjamin was sitting at the big wooden table in one of the rooms above his patent office. He just received a letter from his wife, Carrie, that said she and their 2-year-old son, Wharton, were sick. Worried, Ben poured himself another glass of whiskey and fiddled absently with his pipe and tobacco pouch. Maybe he should abandon the plan and just go home to St. Louis, at least until Carrie and the children were all healthy again. But just when the whiskey had really started to warm his insides, Ben suddenly heard footsteps on the creaky stairway that led up to the room where he was now sitting. He felt a flash of concern. He wasn't expecting any visitors that day, and whoever had come inside had not rung the bell at the front desk. Getting up from the table, Ben walked unsteadily to the door and peered down the hallway. But who he saw standing there immediately put him at ease. It was the man in the bowler hat. A man Benjamin knew well and had seen many times at Dr. Holmes's hotel in Chicago. But what on earth was the man doing here now? The man in the bowler hat casually slipped right past Ben and settled himself at the wooden table. Without a word, he pulled a brand new pint of whiskey out of a coat pocket and put that down on the table as well. An hour later, just before Ben's eyes closed and his chin dipped to his chest, The man in the bowler hat realized with satisfaction that Ben was very, very drunk. Once he was sure Ben was asleep, the man in the bowler hat pulled a small bottle of chloroform from another coat pocket, along with a big square of clean white cloth. The man tipped the contents of the bottle onto the cloth. Then, standing up and walking over to Ben, the man in the bowler hat pressed the cloth over Ben's mouth and nose. In low doses, chloroform can dull the sensation of pain. In high doses, when inhaled or swallowed, it can be deadly. The man in the bowler hat repeated the sequence several times, gradually upping the amount of chloroform he was administering to his victim. The man did not rush. He enjoyed feeling the slight jerk every time he pressed the cloth against Ben's face. Once the man was sure that Ben was dead, or at least close to it, he pulled Ben's body onto the floor on his back and then poured another 2 ounces of the chloroform straight down Ben's throat, pressing down on Ben's chest at regular intervals to ensure that the drug made its way into Ben's stomach. Once he was satisfied that Ben was dead, the man in the bowler hat carefully arranged the scene so it would look like an accident, and just before he left, he set fire to Ben's hair and coaxed the flame down along the skin of Ben's face. But it would turn out the killer made a huge miscalculation, because the doctors at the morgue who would examine Benjamin's body just hours after it was discovered 2 days later on September 4th, they would find evidence that Ben's death was not an accident. That red fluid they saw draining out of the side of Ben's mouth was apparently a telltale sign that large amounts of chloroform had been forced into his stomach. It would turn out Benjamin was not the man in the bowler hat's first murder victim. Many of the missing people back in Chicago, including Julia Connor, her daughter Pearl, and Emmeline Segrand, whose heartbroken families and friends had written letters to Dr. Holmes asking for his help, had been lured into Dr. Holmes's hotel by this man in the bowler hat where he would kill them. And to everyone's shock, the man in the bowler hat was none other than Dr. Holmes himself. But as shocking as that was, it was nothing compared to the horrific details of the crimes